The autumn wind moved across the Mesopotamian plateau like a whisper, carrying secrets from the distant past. On a hillside near the ancient city of Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey, a Kurdish shepherd named Şafak Yildiz watched his flock drift across land that had known 10,000 generations of footsteps. The year was 1994, and the morning carried the same dry heat that had baked this landscape since humans first learned to name the seasons. Yildiz noticed something unusual protruding from the soil. At first glance, the stones scattered across the hilltop appeared natural, shaped by millennia of wind and rain. But something about their arrangement troubled him. They seemed too uniform, too deliberately placed. He knelt and brushed away centuries of accumulated dirt, and his fingers found smoothness where erosion should have created jagged edges. These weren't natural formations. Someone had carved them. The local authorities arrived within days. Then came the archaeologists, initially dismissive of yet another peasant claiming to have found ancient treasure. But one man saw something others missed. Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist, reached the site in the spring of 1995 with the weary skepticism of someone who had investigated countless false alarms. He expected medieval ruins at best, perhaps Ottoman foundations buried by time and neglect. What he found instead defied everything his training had taught him about when human civilization actually began. The excavation revealed massive limestone pillars shaped like the letter T, each standing between 3 and 6 meters tall, weighing up to 20 tons. They weren't scattered randomly, but arranged in precise circular formations, their surfaces covered with intricate carvings of animals, lions, foxes, scorpions, vultures rendered with artistic sophistication that suggested not primitive scratching, but deliberate, practiced skill. The pillars had been quarried from bedrock, transported uphill, carved with stone tools, then erected in patterns that required planning, coordination, and mathematical understanding. Schmidt's team extracted organic material trapped in the mortar between stones and sent samples for carbon dating. The results arrived like a thunderclap through the archaeological community. The construction dated to approximately 9600 BCE, not 9600 years ago from some arbitrary starting point, but 9600 years before the Common Era began, over 11,600 years in the past. According to every textbook, every university course, every museum display teaching human history to millions of schoolchildren, this was impossible. In 9600 BCE, humans were supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers, living in small nomadic bands, following migrating herds, sleeping in temporary shelters, possessing neither the organizational capacity nor the engineering knowledge required to create monumental architecture. They hadn't yet discovered agriculture. They hadn't invented pottery. They hadn't conceived of the wheel. They were, according to established chronology, at least 6,000 years away from building anything remotely resembling Göbekli Tepe. Yet here it stood, buried deliberately under tons of soil by its creators, for reasons no one could explain, preserved through millennia of human ignorance about its existence. The site predated Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predated the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000 years. It predated the rise of Mesopotamian city-states, the invention of writing, the development of metallurgy, and every other marker supposedly defining the beginning of civilization. Schmidt stood among those ancient pillars and understood he had stumbled onto something that would force humanity to rewrite its origin story. If people could build this in 9600 BCE, then everything we believed about our past was built on foundations as unstable as desert sand. The shepherd had uncovered more than stones. He had opened a door into a past that wasn't supposed to exist. But Göbekli Tepe wasn't alone. Within months of Göbekli Tepe's revelation, whispers began circulating through archaeological conferences and academic journals. Other sites were emerging from the earth and sea, each one challenging the same fundamental assumptions about human capability in the deep past. What initially seemed like a singular anomaly in southeastern Turkey revealed itself as part of something far more unsettling, a global pattern of advanced construction that predated civilization itself. Just 35 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe, excavation began at Karahan Tepe in 1997. The site displayed the same sophisticated megalithic architecture, the same intricate animal carvings, the same impossible engineering. Preliminary dating suggested it might be even older than its famous neighbor, pushing organized construction further back into an era when such achievements weren't supposed to exist. But Turkey held only the beginning of the pattern. Off the coast of India, near Dwarka, marine archaeologists discovered underwater structures showing organized geometry beneath waters that had risen with melting glaciers over 9,000 years ago. In the Gulf of Kambat, sonar imaging revealed grid-like patterns on the seafloor at depths, suggesting submersion during the last ice age's end. The Indian government funded investigations. The structures appeared deliberately constructed. Their location underwater meant they had been built when sea levels stood dramatically lower before 10,000 BCE, when humans supposedly lacked the capacity for urban planning. In Egypt, geologist Robert Schoch examined weathering patterns on the Sphinx and found something establishment Egyptology couldn't explain. The erosion patterns suggested water damage, not wind and sand. Heavy rainfall had carved those distinctive patterns, but Egypt's last period of sustained precipitation ended around 10,000 BCE, thousands of years before the Sphinx was officially dated. Either the dating was wrong, or the climate records were wrong, or someone had built one of Egypt's most famous monuments in an era when civilization wasn't supposed to exist. Indonesia presented perhaps the most radical challenge. At Gunung Padang, excavations revealed buried structures beneath what appeared to be a natural hill. Carbon dating of organic materials trapped in construction layers returned dates approaching 20,000 BCE, 20,000 years ago. The implications were staggering. If verified, humans were building sophisticated structures, while mainstream archaeology insisted they were still living in caves, following game animals across frozen continents. In South America, precisely cut megalithic foundations in Peru and Bolivia showed construction techniques that defied conventional chronologies. The stones fit together with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, their surfaces bearing marks of advanced cutting methods that predated accepted Incan timelines by thousands of years. Some blocks weighed over 100 tons, transported across mountains and valleys, fitted into walls with precision modern engineers struggle to replicate. At each site, archaeologists encountered the same pattern of resistance. Initial findings met with skepticism. Publication in peer-reviewed journals took years longer than standard research. Funding dried up. Conference presentations were relegated to minor sessions. Careers stalled. The evidence was documented using standard scientific methods, carbon dating, stratigraphy, geological analysis, yet somehow the implications remained marginalized, treated as controversial rather than revolutionary. The sites shared disturbing commonalities: megalithic construction using multi-ton stones, quarried and transported with methods that shouldn't have existed; astronomical alignments requiring mathematical sophistication and long-term observation; engineering demanding organizational complexity that hunter-gatherer societies weren't supposed to possess; and dating that pushed them all into periods when human civilization was allegedly confined to small nomadic groups surviving at subsistence level. These weren't claims from fringe theorists or pseudoscientific documentaries. These were findings by credentialed archaeologists, published in legitimate journals, verified through repeatable testing methods. Yet they remained absent from textbooks, unmentioned in mainstream historical narratives, invisible in public education. The pattern was clear. Across continents, separated by oceans, cultures with no supposed contact had built structures requiring identical levels of sophistication at times when such achievement was considered impossible. But if these sites prove humans built cities thousands of years earlier than we're taught, why don't we know about them? The story we're taught about human civilization's origins was assembled in an era when archaeology was barely distinguishing itself from treasure hunting. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as universities formalized the study of ancient cultures, scholars constructed a timeline based on limited evidence, filtered through Victorian assumptions about progress, biblical chronologies, and colonial ideologies that positioned European civilization as the inevitable culmination of human development. That timeline became the foundation everything else was built upon. Paleolithic hunter-gatherers wandering in primitive bands, a gradual transition to Neolithic farming around 10,000 BCE, the first cities emerging in Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE, Bronze Age civilizations in Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, Iron Age empires, classical antiquity. The narrative was clean, linear, satisfying in its simplicity. And then, it was written into textbooks, embedded in university curricula, built into museum displays visited by millions, reinforced through professional consensus that rewarded confirmation and punished deviation. The timeline stopped being a hypothesis subject to revision and became institutional infrastructure too massive to modify without collapsing entire academic disciplines. The mechanisms preserving this chronology operate with mechanical efficiency. Academic specialization creates silos, where archaeologists studying one region or period never communicate with colleagues whose findings might collectively challenge broader narratives. An expert on Mesopotamian pottery shards doesn't attend conferences on Indonesian megalithic sites. A scholar analyzing Egyptian tomb inscriptions doesn't read journals publishing carbon dates from Turkish excavations. The pieces that might form a revolutionary picture remain scattered across isolated domains of expertise. Publication bias favors incremental confirmatory findings over paradigm-challenging discoveries. Journals prefer articles that fit existing frameworks, that answer questions already considered legitimate. Revolutionary claims require extraordinary review processes, face heightened skepticism, demand more rigorous evidence than confirmatory research. The bar rises exactly when findings threaten established chronologies. Funding structures direct resources toward questions that assume current timelines are correct. Grant proposals challenging fundamental dating receive unfavorable reviews. Research agendas must align with accepted narratives to secure institutional support. Archaeologists learn early in their careers which questions lead to funding and which lead to rejection. The human cost is measured in derailed careers. Robert Schoch faced professional isolation for suggesting the Sphinx might be older than Egyptology allows. Danny Hillman Natawijaya encountered resistance publishing Gunung Padang's early dates. Dozens of others have watched tenure denied, conference invitations withdrawn, collaborative opportunities evaporate after proposing chronologies that contradict established timelines. The message is clear: challenge the framework at your professional peril. Individual archaeologists aren't villains protecting deliberate lies. They're professionals operating within systems that punish paradigm-challenging research regardless of evidence quality. A young scholar seeking tenure knows that revolutionary claims, even if correct, will be scrutinized more harshly than confirmatory studies. A department chair understands that hiring someone associated with controversial chronologies might jeopardize funding from conservative donors and grant institutions. A journal editor recognizes that publishing radical redating could damage the publication's reputation among establishment reviewers. The timeline persists, not because evidence supports it, but because enormous infrastructure depends on its stability. Museum displays would require complete redesign, textbooks would need rewriting, curricula would demand restructuring, decades of scholarship would be rendered obsolete. The psychological and financial costs of admitting fundamental error are too high, so the system protects itself through normal operations rather than malicious conspiracy. This creates suppression more effective than any coordinated cover-up could achieve. No shadowy organization needs to hide evidence. The structure does it automatically by making radical findings professionally dangerous, financially unrewarding, and institutionally unwelcome. But there's one site where the evidence is so overwhelming, so precisely documented, that it forces even skeptics to acknowledge something is profoundly wrong with what we've been taught. Standing among the megaliths of Göbekli Tepe, you feel the weight of impossible time pressing against your understanding of what humans could achieve. The site sprawls across the hilltop in a series of circular and oval structures, each defined by enormous T-shaped limestone pillars rising 18 feet from earth that hasn't seen sunlight in over 10,000 years. Some pillars weigh 20 tons. They stand in concentric rings, arranged with precision that suggests not random placement, but deliberate architectural planning. Layer 3 represents the oldest accessible level, dated through carbon analysis to 9600 through 8800 BCE. Walking through these ancient circles creates a cathedral-like sensation, though no roof ever covered these spaces. The pillars tower overhead, their surfaces impossibly smooth for stones shaped before metal tools existed. Where they join the ground, their bases fit into carved sockets, with tolerances measured in fractions of inches, stabilized with carefully placed stones that have held them upright through 11 millennia of earthquakes, erosion, and the slow grinding passage of seasons. But the engineering alone doesn't capture what makes this place extraordinary. The artistic sophistication does that. Every surface tells stories in stone. Elaborate bas-reliefs cover the pillars in flowing compositions that rival classical Greek sculpture in dynamism and naturalism. Foxes prowl across limestone faces. Lions bare their teeth mid-roar. Bulls charge with muscles tensed. Snakes coil around curves. Scorpions raise their stingers. Vultures spread wings caught mid-flight. The animals move with anatomical accuracy that demonstrates intimate knowledge of their subjects, rendered by artisans who understood proportion, perspective, and the relationship between form and meaning. Abstract symbols appear between the animals' geometric patterns whose significance remains locked in the minds of their dead creators. H-shapes, crescents, circles, cut marks, carved with deliberate placement that suggests meaning beyond decoration. Some researchers believe they represent astronomical observations. Others think they're religious iconography. No one knows for certain, and the silence of these symbols across 11,000 years creates a peculiar vertigo, like reading a language that feels almost familiar but refuses to resolve into comprehension. Certain pillars bear anthropomorphic features that transform them from architectural elements into something resembling statues or deities. Arms carved in relief bend at the elbows. Hands meet at waists. Belts with elaborate buckles suggest clothing or ceremonial dress. These aren't supporting columns but representations, stylized human figures frozen in eternal assembly, witnesses to rituals we can only imagine. The engineering required to create this defies the timeline we're taught. Each pillar was quarried from bedrock, using techniques that leave no tool marks we recognize. Modern experiments attempting to replicate the process using period-appropriate stone tools have failed to achieve comparable results. Somehow, workers in the 10th millennium BCE extracted these masses from living rock, shaped them with precision, then transported them up to a quarter-mile from quarry to construction site. Without wheels, without draft animals, without metal tools, without any of the technological prerequisites we assume megalithic construction requires. Then they erected these pillars into pre-dug sockets, aligned them into complex circular patterns, and stabilized them so thoroughly that they've survived longer than the Egyptian pyramids have existed. Excavation revealed additional mysteries that deepen rather than resolve questions about the site's purpose. No evidence of habitation exists, no residential structures, no cooking areas, no domestic refuse suggesting people lived here. This wasn't a settlement. It was something else entirely. Animal bones scattered throughout the fill show evidence of large-scale feasting. Thousands of people gathering periodically, consuming gazelles and wild cattle in quantities, suggesting celebration or ritual rather than survival. The bones tell of community meals, shared ceremonies, gatherings that drew populations from across the region to this hilltop for purposes that transcended mere subsistence. And then, around 8000 BCE, someone deliberately buried the entire complex. They filled the circular structures with soil and debris, covering the pillars, hiding the carvings, erasing every visible trace of what had been built. The burial was methodical, careful, almost reverent, preserving everything perfectly while concealing it from view. Why? The question hangs in the air, like dust suspended in sunlight, filtering through excavation tarps. What we can verify creates cognitive dissonance against everything archaeology teaches about human development. This level of organizational complexity, artistic achievement, and engineering sophistication supposedly requires settled agricultural societies with social stratification, specialized labor, surplus food production, and generations of accumulated knowledge. Yet Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture, it predates pottery, it predates the wheel, writing, metallurgy, and every other technological marker supposedly necessary for civilization. Inside these stone circles, carvings tell stories we can't read, created by people who weren't supposed to exist yet, using techniques we still can't explain. But who built this? And more disturbing, how did they know how to build it without any apparent practice or developmental progression? According to the archaeological timeline we're taught, the people who built Göbekli Tepe lived in the pre-pottery Neolithic A period. They were hunter-gatherers. No agriculture meant no permanent settlements. No pottery meant no sophisticated storage. No metal tools meant stone and bone implements. No domesticated animals meant no pack animals for transportation. They should have existed in small mobile bands of 20 to 50 individuals, following seasonal animal migrations, gathering wild plants, sleeping in temporary shelters, possessing social structures too simple for large-scale coordinated projects. Yet they built Göbekli Tepe. The contradiction isn't subtle. It's a chasm between what the evidence shows and what human capability was supposedly limited to in 9600 BCE. Quarrying and moving 10 to 20-ton stones demands hundreds of workers coordinating simultaneously. You can't accomplish that feat with a nomadic band of 50 people stopping briefly on their seasonal migration route. The physics alone requires massive coordinated effort teams, working in shifts, specialized roles for quarrying versus transportation versus erection, leadership structures capable of directing complex multi-stage operations. Carving the detailed bas-reliefs covering the pillars requires specialized artisans. The anatomical accuracy of the animals, the flowing composition of the scenes, the precision of the geometric symbols, these demonstrate years of training and experience. Artistic sophistication at this level doesn't emerge spontaneously. It requires masters teaching apprentices, techniques refined through practice, aesthetic traditions passed between generations. The architectural planning of these circular structures demands mathematical and geometric knowledge. The pillars aren't randomly placed, but positioned according to patterns requiring measurement, calculation, and spatial reasoning. Someone designed these layouts before construction began, solving engineering problems about weight distribution, structural stability, and visual harmony. Sustained construction over decades or centuries requires social organization capable of feeding, housing, and coordinating large workforces. Even if people gathered periodically rather than permanently, someone had to organize these gatherings, allocate responsibilities, resolve disputes, and maintain continuity between assembly periods. Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who excavated Göbekli Tepe, proposed a revolutionary interpretation that attempted to resolve this paradox. He suggested the traditional causation was backwards. Cities didn't emerge from agriculture. Göbekli Tepe's construction created conditions that led to agriculture. The theory inverts everything we assume about civilization's development. According to Schmidt, the drive to build this monumental site, whether motivated by religion, astronomy, or purposes we can't fathom, required so many people gathering periodically that it created enormous pressure to develop reliable food sources nearby. Feeding hundreds of workers couldn't depend on uncertain hunting and gathering. Someone needed to ensure sufficient supplies existed when construction demanded it. Wild einkorn wheat grew naturally in the region surrounding Göbekli Tepe. Evidence suggests it may have been among the first plants humans deliberately cultivated, potentially to support the workforce gathering for construction and ceremony. Gazelle bones found at the site show patterns suggesting managed hunting rather than random predation, early attempts at controlling animal populations to ensure reliable protein sources. The gradual transition to settled agricultural life occurred in this exact region during and after Göbekli Tepe's period of use. The correlation suggests causation, implying that ceremonial and religious drives preceded economic and practical developments rather than following from them. The interpretation is elegant, intellectually satisfying, and addresses many paradoxes. But it doesn't fully resolve the deepest problem. Even granting that religious fervor motivated construction and eventually led to agriculture, one question remains stubbornly unanswered. Where did the knowledge come from? Architectural planning doesn't emerge fully formed. Engineering principles require experimentation, failure, learning, incremental improvement. Stoneworking techniques develop through generations of practice. Organizational systems evolve gradually as societies grow more complex. Yet Göbekli Tepe's oldest excavated layers demonstrate the same sophistication as later ones. There's no apparent learning curve, no progression from crude early attempts to refined later achievements. The builders arrived possessing knowledge and capability that should have required centuries of developmental progression. Either they inherited this knowledge from somewhere else, brought it from another region where that progression occurred, or possessed capabilities we fundamentally don't understand about pre-agricultural societies. The people who built Göbekli Tepe weren't supposed to have agriculture, writing, or cities, yet they carved stones with artistry, rivaling classical Greece, and moved masses that challenge modern engineering. Unless the knowledge didn't develop at Göbekli Tepe at all, unless it came from somewhere older, somewhere we haven't found yet, or somewhere that no longer exists, Klaus Schmidt made a decision that frustrated many and intrigued others. He deliberately slowed excavation of Göbekli Tepe, believing the majority of the site should remain buried for future generations possessing better technology and methods. Ground-penetrating radar revealed what his restraint protected: multiple additional circular structures beneath the currently excavated level, potentially older than anything yet exposed, possibly larger and more elaborate. Only 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. The remaining 95% waits in darkness, holding answers to questions we haven't learned to ask properly yet. What radar imaging suggests creates unsettling possibilities. If the oldest exposed layer already demonstrates complete architectural and artistic sophistication, what lies beneath? Standard archaeological expectation would predict progression from simpler to complex as excavation reaches deeper, older levels. But what if the pattern runs opposite? What if the oldest layers show even greater sophistication, suggesting not evolution but devolution knowledge degrading over time rather than accumulating? The possibility that Göbekli Tepe wasn't the beginning but a remnant forces reconsideration of everything the site represents. Southeastern Turkey has yielded other pre-pottery Neolithic sites receiving far less attention than Göbekli Tepe, but displaying comparable features. Karahan Tepe, 35 kilometers away, shows similar T-shaped pillars and complex architectural planning. Preliminary dating suggests it might predate Göbekli Tepe, pushing the timeline for this level of construction even further back. Harbetsuvan Tepesi displays comparable megalithic features. Sefer Tepe, currently under excavation, reveals additional structures fitting the same pattern. This region appears to have been a center of extraordinary activity in the 10th and 9th millennia BCE, with dozens of sites demonstrating advanced construction and artistic capability that shouldn't exist according to conventional chronology. Two possibilities emerge from this concentration. Either southeastern Turkey independently developed civilization thousands of years before anywhere else in the world, then mysteriously abandoned it, leaving no clear descendants or continuity, or these sites represent remnants of knowledge originating from an even earlier period we haven't discovered. The first option creates as many questions as it answers. Civilizations don't typically appear fully formed, flourish briefly, then vanish without trace or legacy. The second option opens more disturbing territory. Where might earlier origins exist if not in the archaeological record we've examined? The answer might lie beneath hundreds of feet of ocean water. The last ice age ended around 11,600 years ago. Global sea levels stood approximately 400 feet lower than today. Coastlines extended miles beyond current shores. River deltas sprawled across land now submerged. The most fertile, resource-rich, climatically moderate regions, exactly where early human populations would cluster, are now underwater. If complex societies existed before the ice melted, their remains would be precisely where we can't easily look, on continental shelves, in submerged river valleys, beneath sediment accumulated over millennia of marine deposition. Recent underwater archaeology has begun revealing structures in areas that haven't been dry land for 8 to 12,000 years. Submerged formations off India's coast show geometric patterns, suggesting deliberate construction. Underwater structures near Japan display right angles and surface modifications inconsistent with natural geology. Sites in the Mediterranean reveal building foundations beneath sediment layers dated to the early Holocene. Each discovery faces the same skeptical reception. Göbekli Tepe initially encountered initial dismissal, delayed publication, marginalization of researchers proposing human origins for the structures. But the evidence accumulates nonetheless. Global flood mythologies suddenly acquire uncomfortable specificity. Nearly every ancient culture preserves stories of catastrophic inundation destroying earlier civilizations. Mesopotamian epics describe the deluge. Hebrew texts recount Noah's flood. Greek myths speak of Deucalion's flood. Indian Puranas detail Manu's flood. Indigenous American traditions across both continents describe world-destroying waters. Chinese legends preserve flood narratives. Australian Aboriginal stories tell of rising seas swallowing coastal lands. What if these aren't myths but memories, cultural recollections of real catastrophe transmitted through generations until the events became legend? What we call the beginning of civilization might be remnants of a middle period, with true origins lying beneath oceans that rose when the Ice Age ended, swallowing coastlines where the first cities might have flourished. Only 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. Beneath what we've found, radar shows something larger, older, possibly more sophisticated than anything yet revealed. And there's growing evidence that the oceans hold answers, entire landscapes now hundreds of feet beneath the waves, where the first human cities might have flourished before the world was swallowed by the flood. 20,000 years ago, Earth wore a different face. Massive ice sheets, miles thick in places, covered Canada, northern Europe, and vast stretches of Asia. The weight of all that frozen water pulled from the oceans meant sea levels stood 400 feet lower than the coastlines we know today. Where waves now crash against continental shelves, dry land stretched for miles, sometimes hundreds of miles beyond what modern maps show as shore. These weren't barren wastelands. They were the best real estate on the planet. Coastal plains offered everything early human populations needed. Maritime resources provided reliable protein, fish, shellfish, seabirds, nesting in coastal cliffs. Rivers flowing to the sea created fertile deltas, rich with fresh water and alluvial soil. The climate remained moderate compared to glaciated interiors, where winters killed the unprepared. Natural harbours facilitated trade and travel along coastlines, allowing cultural exchange and technological diffusion. If you wanted to find where civilization first developed, you'd look at the coasts. That's where complexity emerges, where populations concentrate, where innovation accelerates through contact and competition. Except all those coasts are now underwater. The geography of that drowned world would seem alien to modern eyes. Between Britain and continental Europe stretched Doggerland, dry land supporting forests, rivers, and large human populations where the North Sea now flows. The Persian Gulf was a fertile river valley rather than a body of water, with the Tigris and Euphrates joining into a single waterway running through what's now seafloor. The Red Sea narrowed significantly, with exposed coastlines on both sides. Indonesia's scattered islands connected into a continuous landmass called Sundaland, spanning an area larger than India. Every continent was larger. Hundreds of miles of coastline surrounded landmasses that no longer exist above water. Then, the world ended. Around 11,600 years ago, rapid warming triggered catastrophic ice sheet collapse. The collapse wasn't gradual, it pulsed. Some periods saw sea levels rising 10 to 15 feet in a single century. Imagine watching the ocean advance that far within a human lifetime. Settlements built on coastlines would flood within decades. Agricultural lands carefully cultivated over generations would disappear beneath salt water. Sacred sites, architectural achievements, accumulated knowledge, all swallowed by advancing tides. The rise continued for thousands of years, eventually lifting ocean levels approximately 400 feet from their ice age minimum. Entire landscapes vanished. River valleys became submarine canyons. Coastal plains transformed into continental shelves. Islands drowned completely, their former existence marked only by shallow banks navigational charts warned ships to avoid. For populations living in those zones, the catastrophe would have been total. Forced migration to higher ground, competition for remaining habitable land, the destruction of whatever civilizations had developed in the most favorable environments Earth offered. And here's the archaeological crisis this creates. If the earliest complex societies developed in coastal regions, as virtually all modern civilizations have, and those regions are now hundreds of feet underwater, then our archaeological record is fundamentally incomplete. We're trying to understand civilization's origins, while missing the most likely locations where it began. The scale of loss staggers comprehension. Approximately 11 million square miles of land that was above water during the Ice Age is now submerged. That's an area larger than Africa. Every square mile potentially contained archaeological sites, settlement remains, architectural structures, agricultural terraces, trade ports, religious centers, burial grounds, the accumulated material culture of thousands of years of human activity. Gone, buried beneath sediment, crushed by water pressure, scattered by currents, beyond the reach of most archaeological investigation. The conventional timeline places civilizations beginning around 4000 BCE, Sumerian cities, Egyptian dynasties, the first writing systems. But the catastrophic flooding that would have destroyed coastal civilizations occurred between 11,600 and 8,000 BCE. If advanced societies existed before the flood, their remains are exactly where we can't easily find them. The world we're taught history began in is a drowned world. 11 million square miles of prime human habitation zone now rest hundreds of feet beneath the ocean, holding answers to questions about our origins that we can't ask because we don't know what existed there. But what if we could look beneath those waves? What if marine archaeology has already found evidence of the civilizations the flood destroyed? The Bimini Road lies submerged off the coast of the Bahamas, discovered in 1968 by divers who couldn't quite believe what their eyes reported. Rectangular limestone blocks, each several feet across, arranged in linear patterns extending for nearly half a mile. The depth suggests submersion around 10,000 BCE, when sea levels were rising rapidly from Ice Age lows. Geologists debate whether the formation is natural beach rock fractured by wave action into regular patterns or artificial. But the features that intrigue researchers persist despite explanations: regular spacing between blocks, consistent right angles, apparent tool marks on surfaces, and arrangements that seem deliberately architectural rather than randomly geological. Off the coast of Gujarat, India, the evidence becomes harder to dismiss. Side-scan sonar mapping near the ancient city of Dwarka revealed geometric patterns on the sea floor, stone structures showing right-angled joints. Artifacts recovered during investigation include pottery fragments and carved stones bearing marks of deliberate shaping. The construction sits in areas that haven't been dry land for approximately 9,000 years, according to sea level charts documenting post-Ice Age ocean rise. The Gulf of Khambhat discovery in 2001 created scientific controversy that still hasn't resolved. Indian marine archaeologists identified what appeared to be geometric structures extending across considerable area, showing grid-like layouts characteristic of planned urban design. The team recovered artifacts from the site and subjected them to carbon dating. The results returned dates of 9,500 years old. If verified, this would predate Sumerian cities by 6,000 years. Mainstream archaeology has largely ignored or dismissed the findings, citing contamination concerns with the carbon dating and arguing the structures could be natural geological formations. But the investigators maintain their position. The patterns show organization that natural processes rarely create. Off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan's southernmost island, divers in 1986 found massive stone structures featuring flat surfaces, right angles, and formations resembling staircases and terraces. The monument sits at depths corresponding to submersion around 10,000 BCE. The debate over Yonaguni has raged for decades. Geologist Robert Schoch argues the features are primarily natural rock formations, possibly modified by human activity. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura contends the structures show clear evidence of artificial terracing and carving. Both might be partially correct. Throughout the Mediterranean, underwater structures appear along the coasts of Greece, Egypt, and Lebanon. Some show unambiguous signs of human construction: foundation blocks, harbour installations, building remains. The complication arrives with their dating. Many exist at depths or in locations, suggesting construction periods that predate accepted chronologies for advanced civilization in those regions. Then there's Cuba. In 2001, sonar imaging off Cuba's western coast revealed geometric patterns and pyramid-like structures at depths approaching 2,000 feet. The discovery generated international attention, then mysteriously vanished from research agendas. Further investigation was restricted, access denied, and the findings relegated to unexplored mystery. The official explanations for the restriction remain vague. The depth alone creates problems. 2,000 feet underwater suggests submersion timeframes reaching far beyond the end of the last ice age, into periods when conventional chronology insists humans had neither the capability nor the organization for urban construction. Scientific rigor demands acknowledging controversies. Mainstream marine geology attributes most of these formations to natural processes: fracture patterns in bedrock, erosion, creating regular shapes, volcanic activity, producing geometric features. Dating underwater structures presents enormous challenges, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence beyond what currently exists for most sites. But there's a systemic problem underlying the debate. Underwater archaeology is expensive. Research vessels, specialized equipment, trained divers, extended expeditions all require funding that terrestrial archaeology rarely receives, let alone marine investigation. Many governments restrict access to underwater sites, citing national security or tourism concerns. And the academic bias against Atlantis hunting means researchers investigating underwater structures risk professional credibility, funding loss, and career damage. So most sites remain unexplored, their nature undetermined. Yet the pattern persists across the world. In locations that would have been coastlines during the Ice Age, structures keep appearing that show geometric organization, right angles, and regular patterns features natural geology rarely produces, but that characterize human construction. From India to Japan, from the Bahamas to the Mediterranean, Sonar keeps finding the same thing beneath coastal waters: geometric patterns, right angles, structures in places that haven't been dry land since the Ice Age ended. Whether each individual site proves artificial or natural, the accumulated evidence suggests something was lost to post-Ice Age flooding that our current historical narrative doesn't account for. But these underwater sites don't stand alone. Ancient myths and legends from every culture describe the same catastrophe: a great flood that destroyed the world before ours. Marine archaeology operates under constraints that make comprehensive investigation of submerged Ice Age coastlines effectively impossible with current resources. Research vessels capable of deep water operation cost tens of thousands of dollars per day. Specialized sonar equipment, remotely operated vehicles, and trained personnel add expenses that few institutions can justify for speculative exploration. The limited visibility in murky coastal waters, exactly where ancient settlements would cluster, reduces effectiveness of visual investigation. Sediment accumulation buries structures, rendering them invisible to standard sonar scanning. And the area requiring survey is vast beyond practical coverage. Less than 5% of the ocean floor has been mapped in high resolution. Of the submerged continental shelves where Ice Age coastal settlements would have existed, less than 1% has been archaeologically surveyed. Funding for underwater archaeology represents a tiny fraction of already limited archaeological budgets, most directed toward excavating known terrestrial sites rather than searching unknown marine areas. Yet when technology and resources align, discoveries emerge. High-resolution multi-beam sonar reveals seafloor features previously invisible to investigation. Remotely operated vehicles enable exploration at depths impossible for human divers, equipped with cameras and sampling tools that bring the deep ocean within research reach. Satellite bathymetry identifies surface anomalies, suggesting underwater structures worthy of closer examination. The Doggerland project demonstrates what systematic investigation can achieve. Researchers obtained data from offshore oil industry surveys conducted for commercial purposes, but containing archaeological gold mines, and used it to map the drowned landscape between Britain and continental Europe. The results revealed river systems, lake beds, and terrain features indicating prime human habitat from 10,000 to 7,000 BCE, when this region supported forests and large animal populations. Trawler nets operating in the area have recovered worked flints, bone tools, and even preserved tree trunks, proving this was populated landscape rather than empty wilderness before the North Sea flooded the region. Robert Ballard's Black Sea expeditions found preserved shipwrecks and shoreline structures from when the Black Sea was a freshwater lake, before catastrophic flooding around 5600 BCE raised water levels by hundreds of feet, drowning coastal settlements. The anaerobic deep water preserved organic materials with remarkable fidelity, demonstrating how quickly coastal civilizations can be submerged and how well underwater environments can protect archaeological evidence from decay. These discoveries hint at possibilities that systematic surveying might reveal. Submerged river deltas could show large-scale settlement and agricultural development from before the accepted agricultural revolution. Investigation of drowned islands might find megalithic constructions predating known sites. Exploration of deep water areas that were coastal during the Ice Age might discover evidence of maritime societies operating at sophistication levels we have no record of. The implications extend beyond academic curiosity. If advanced coastal civilizations existed before the flood, understanding how they adapted or failed to adapt to catastrophic climate change and sea level rise might provide insights for contemporary civilization facing similar challenges. Their solutions and failures, their migration patterns and social transformations, their technological responses to environmental catastrophe, all lie preserved in sediment layers beneath hundreds of feet of water. We possess the technology to investigate these questions. Multi-beam sonar, autonomous underwater vehicles, satellite monitoring, and data processing algorithms could systematically survey submerged continental shelves, identifying anomalies warranting closer examination. But we lack the will, the funding, and perhaps the readiness to confront what such investigation might reveal about how wrong our historical timeline might be. We've mapped Mars more thoroughly than we've mapped the ocean floor where human settlements would have existed before the flood. When we do look in the rare instances where resources and permission align, we keep finding things that shouldn't be there according to conventional chronology. The ocean hides not just water and marine life, but potentially the most important chapter of human history. The chapter we've been missing because it's written in stones beneath the waves, in foundations buried under sediment, in the drowned landscapes where civilization might have first emerged before catastrophe forced humanity to begin again. But there's another form of evidence that survived the flood. Not stones beneath the sea, but stories in human memory, flood myths that every culture tells, describing the same catastrophe in remarkably similar ways. Every child raised in Western culture knows the story of Noah. Divine judgment delivered through water. One righteous family saved on an ark with animals. Humanity beginning again after the waters receded and the dove returned with an olive branch. The narrative feels uniquely biblical, deeply embedded in Judeo-Christian tradition. Except it isn't unique at all. The biblical account wasn't even the first version written down. The Epic of Gilgamesh, carved into clay tablets around 2100 BCE, but describing events from earlier eras, contains the same story with different names. Utnapishtim receives divine warning of coming flood. He builds a boat according to specific dimensions. He loads it with animals and family. The flood destroys all other life. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. Birds are sent to find land. Humanity begins again. The Sumerian Eridu Genesis, written approximately 300 years earlier than Gilgamesh, tells of Ziusudra surviving catastrophic flooding sent by gods angry with humanity's noise and corruption. The Akkadian Atrahasis epic presents identical narrative structure with slight variations in detail. These aren't literary borrowings from Hebrew sources. They predate biblical texts by centuries, suggesting the biblical Noah story is itself a retelling of older Mesopotamian tradition. But Mesopotamia doesn't hold the only versions. Greek mythology preserves the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Zeus decides to destroy corrupt humanity through deluge. Prometheus warns his son Deucalion. The couple builds a chest, stocks it with supplies, and survives 9 days of flooding that drowns the world. They land on Mount Parnassus. They repopulate the earth by throwing stones that transform into people. Different cultural context, different divine pantheon, remarkably parallel narrative structure. Hindu tradition describes Manu receiving warning from a fish, later revealed as avatar of Vishnu about coming deluge that will destroy all life. Manu builds a boat, preserves seeds and animals, survives the catastrophe, and becomes ancestor of post-flood humanity. Chinese mythology tells of Gun Yu the Great taming catastrophic floods and establishing the foundations of Chinese civilization. The narrative differs from ark stories, but emphasizes the same core elements: civilization destroying water and heroic preservation of human culture through catastrophe. Cross the Pacific, and the pattern continues. Hopi tradition describes multiple world destructions, including by water, with select people surviving to begin new world ages. Aztec cosmology details previous world ages ending in catastrophe, with floods playing prominent roles. Numerous North American indigenous cultures preserve accounts of great floods, requiring mountain refuges or boat survival. Pacific Islander narratives span thousands of miles of ocean. Hawaiian stories tell of islands flooded by angry gods, with survivors fleeing to mountain peaks. Australian Aboriginal accounts describe coastline submersion in oral traditions preserved for thousands of years, with remarkable geographic accuracy. Stories of lands now underwater that archaeological evidence confirms were indeed coastal. Plains before sea level rise. Polynesian legends speak of ancestral lands swallowed by seas, entire islands disappearing beneath waves. Africa holds flood traditions in Ethiopian and West African mythology. South America contributes Inca, Muisca, and Amazonian accounts of world-destroying deluges. The common patterns emerge across cultural boundaries. Divine or cosmic cause triggers the flood. Warning reaches select individuals or groups before catastrophe strikes. Survival depends on boats, mountains, or floating. The post-flood world differs fundamentally from what existed before. Academic explanations attempt to account for this universality. Flood myths might represent symbolic memory of seasonal river flooding in agricultural societies. They might express metaphorical concepts of moral purification and rebirth. Jungian psychology suggests archetypes emerging from collective unconscious. Cultural diffusion might have spread stories between connected societies. But these explanations face a stubborn problem. How do completely isolated cultures, separated by thousands of miles of ocean and thousands of years of independent development, generate nearly identical narratives about the same type of catastrophe. Australian Aboriginals had no contact with Mesopotamians. Pacific Islanders didn't communicate with Native Americans before modern contact. Yet, their flood narratives share core elements too specific to attribute to pure coincidence or universal archetype. Either humanity possesses some collective unconscious producing identical myths across isolation, a convenient but ultimately unsatisfying explanation, or these stories preserve cultural memory of actual catastrophic flooding events that occurred when modern humans were spreading across the globe. From Mesopotamia to China, from Greece to the Americas, cultures that never contacted each other tell the same story. A flood that destroyed the world, survived by the few who would rebuild civilization. But what if these aren't just myths? What if they're distorted memories of an actual catastrophe that nearly destroyed humanity? The geology doesn't require interpretation. It screams catastrophe in layers of sediment, carved bedrock, and ice core data documenting climate shifts so abrupt they would have seemed apocalyptic to human witnesses. Around 10,900 BCE, Earth's climate did something inexplicable. Global warming that had been steadily melting, Ice Age glaciers suddenly reversed, temperatures plunged back toward near-glacial conditions. The cold snap lasted approximately 1,300 years, long enough for multiple human generations to live and die never knowing warmth their grandparents had experienced. Then, around 9600 BCE, warming resumed even more abruptly than it had stopped. This period, called the Younger Dryas, marked one of the most dramatic climate reversals in recent geological history. When warming resumed, the consequences were catastrophic. Ice sheets covering North America and Europe began melting at accelerated rates. Enormous volumes of water that had been locked in continental glaciers for thousands of years suddenly flowed into oceans. Sea levels rose approximately 400 feet over several millennia, but not gradually, the rise pulsed. Some periods saw 10 to 15 feet of increase per century. For coastal populations, this meant watching their world drown within lifetimes. But sea level rise wasn't the only flood-threatening survival. The Missoula floods provide a glimpse of what catastrophic meant in this period. Geological evidence across the Pacific Northwest shows that ice dams containing vast glacial lakes periodically failed with explosive force. When these dams broke, they released water volumes equivalent to all rivers in the world combined, traveling at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour. The floods carved massive channels through bedrock in days or weeks. They created landscapes of destruction that persisted for thousands of years. Boulders weighing tons were swept hundreds of miles. The scarring is visible today from satellite imagery, unmistakable evidence of water moving with violence beyond normal comprehension. And Missoula wasn't unique. Similar catastrophic outburst floods occurred worldwide. Siberian ice-dammed lakes released into the Arctic Ocean. European ice sheets produced massive meltwater pulses. Antarctic ice shelf collapses generated sudden sea level rise events. Himalayan glacial lakes burst through natural dams, flooding South Asian river valleys with walls of water arriving faster than populations could flee. The Black Sea preserves evidence of particularly dramatic catastrophe. Geological analysis suggests it was a freshwater lake until around 5600 BCE. Then Mediterranean waters catastrophically breached the Bosporus. The marine flood raised the Black Sea level by hundreds of feet within months or years, drowning entire coastal civilizations in the basin. Underwater archaeology has found preserved shoreline structures and settlements from before the flood frozen in time at depths, proving they once stood on dry land. This might be the historical event underlying Near Eastern flood mythology. Other catastrophes contributed to the pattern. The Burckle crater hypothesis presents evidence of a massive meteor impact in the Indian Ocean around 2800 BCE that would have generated tsunamis hundreds of feet high, devastating coastal civilizations throughout the Indian Ocean rim. The Storegga slide around 6100 BCE saw a massive underwater landslide off Norway generate tsunamis over 80 feet high. Geological evidence shows tsunami deposits far inland in Scotland and Norway, marking the reach of waves that would have appeared as divine judgment to coastal populations experiencing them. Meltwater Pulse 1A, around 12,500 BCE, represents one of the most dramatic sea level rise events, approximately 50 feet in less than 500 years. Entire landscapes drowned within a few generations. Coastal settlements built over centuries disappeared beneath advancing seas. Agricultural lands carefully developed became saltwater marshes. These aren't theoretical reconstructions. They're events documented in geological strata, ice cores, sediment analysis, and landform evidence that remains visible today. Catastrophes that definitely occurred. Events that human populations living through them would have experienced as world-ending. If you survived the Missoula flood's instant landscape destruction, you would tell stories of divine judgment through water. If you watched your coastal home disappear beneath rising seas over a lifetime, you would describe the world before being destroyed. If you experienced Black Sea catastrophic flooding, you would emphasize survival depending on reaching high ground or boats. Exactly the narratives preserved in flood mythology across every culture. The geology doesn't lie. Around the time humans were supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers, Earth experienced catastrophic floods so massive they would have seemed like divine judgment to anyone who survived them. But were these floods random natural disasters, or was there a specific trigger, a cosmic impact, that nearly destroyed all life on Earth? Something caused the Younger Dryas. The question has haunted climatologists since they first identified the event in ice core data and geological records. What could make global warming suddenly reverse, plunge temperatures back toward Ice Age conditions for 1,300 years, then resume warming even more abruptly than it stopped? The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes an answer that once seemed fringe, but gains credibility with each new discovery. A fragmented comet struck North America around 10,900 BCE, creating multiple impact sites or airbursts that triggered continental-scale catastrophe. The evidence emerges from sediment layers worldwide. Nanodiamonds appear in geological strata, dating precisely to 10,900 BCE. These microscopic structures only form under extreme temperature and pressure conditions created by cosmic impacts or nuclear explosions. Natural geological processes don't produce them. Their presence in sediment layers from this period, found across North America, Europe, and the Middle East, suggests something generated impact-level temperatures and pressures simultaneously across enormous geographic range. Platinum and iridium concentrations spike in the same layers. Both elements are rare on Earth's surface, but common in asteroids and comets. Finding them concentrated in specific geological horizons indicates extraterrestrial material deposited rapidly, exactly what impact would create. Spherules, tiny glass beads formed when surface materials melt at impact temperatures, then cool rapidly, appear abundantly in Younger Dryas boundary layers. Their chemical composition matches what laboratory experiments predict for impacts, melting surface, soil, and rock. Widespread charcoal deposits suggest continental-scale wildfires. The charcoal layer appears suddenly in the geological record at 10,900 BCE, indicating massive burning across North America and beyond, consistent with impact-triggered fires or airbursts, igniting forests across thousands of square miles. The Carolina Bays present visible evidence still scarring the landscape. Thousands of elliptical depressions dot the southeastern United States, all oriented in the same direction, their long axes pointing toward the Great Lakes region. The pattern matches what computer models predict for ejecta from a major impact material thrown from explosion site, creating secondary craters aligned with the trajectory. Megafauna extinction coincides suspiciously with the impact timing. Woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, American lions, and dozens of other species disappeared between 11,000 and 10,000 BCE. Climate change alone struggles to explain such rapid, comprehensive extinction. Impact effects, wildfires, climate disruption, habitat destruction provide mechanism for sudden mass death. The Clovis culture vanished around 10,900 BCE. This sophisticated Paleo-Indian culture left distinctive tools and evidence of complex society across North America, then disappeared from the archaeological record precisely when the proposed impact occurred. Human populations were severely impacted, possibly reduced to scattered survivors struggling through post-impact catastrophe. Recent discoveries strengthen the hypothesis beyond speculation. The Hiawatha crater, discovered beneath Greenland ice in 2018, shows clear impact features. Dating remains uncertain, but evidence suggests formation during or near the Younger Dryas period. Multiple potential impact sites are being identified across North America as researchers search with new tools and hypotheses guiding investigation. Evidence expands across continents, North America, Europe, and the Middle East all show sudden catastrophic changes in geological and archaeological records at 10,900 BCE changes, too coordinated to attribute to gradual processes or regional events. Scientific debate continues. Some geologists dispute the impact interpretation, proposing alternative explanations for the evidence. The exact mechanism connecting impact to climate change remains debated. Did debris block sunlight? Did ocean circulation disruption trigger cooling? Did ice sheet destabilization create feedback loops? But the hypothesis gains mainstream acceptance. Evidence has accumulated sufficiently that serious investigation replaces dismissal. Papers appear in prestigious journals. NASA includes Younger Dryas impacts in hazard assessment models. The question shifts from, did it happen, to what were the precise mechanisms and effects? Connect this to civilization, questions and disturbing possibilities emerge. If cosmic impact occurred, just as humans potentially developed complex societies, it would have destroyed settlements, killed populations, disrupted food systems, and forced survivors into refugee status. Evidence of pre-impact civilization would be scant, catastrophically reduced or destroyed, while post-impact reconstruction begins the archaeological record we do have. What if Göbekli Tepe wasn't the beginning of civilization but the remembering? Built by survivors of impact catastrophe to preserve and commemorate knowledge from the destroyed world. Around 10,900 BCE, something struck Earth with enough force to end the Ice Age, trigger mass extinctions, and possibly destroy any civilizations that had developed before. And we're only now finding the crater. Which raises the disturbing question. What if humans weren't primitive during this period? What if they had developed complex civilizations that the catastrophe destroyed? Deep in the Chauvet cave in southern France, paintings cover the walls with images that defy everything we assume about Ice Age humans. Created approximately 32,000 years ago, these aren't crude stick figures or primitive scratchings. They're masterworks demonstrating sophisticated understanding of anatomy, movement, perspective, and artistic technique that rivals Renaissance achievement. Horses gallop with muscles tensed mid-stride. Lions prowl with predatory focus. Rhinoceros charge with weight and momentum captured in charcoal and ochre. The artists understood shading to create depth, used the cave wall's natural contours to add three-dimensionality, and mastered techniques that art historians assumed weren't developed until civilization emerged thousands of years later. Lascaux and Altamira show the same sophistication. These weren't accidents. Upper Paleolithic peoples possessed artistic capability, supposedly characteristic of advanced civilizations. Yet they created these works 15 to 30,000 years before cities, writing, or agriculture allegedly existed. The Venus figurines present another puzzle. Carved between 20 and 30,000 years ago, these small female figures appear across Europe and Asia, from France to Siberia, showing consistent stylistic features despite thousands of miles separating their creation sites. Either Ice Age peoples maintained cultural diffusion networks spanning continents, or they shared symbolic systems, suggesting coordinated belief structures across the glaciated world. Both possibilities indicate sophistication that primitive hunter-gatherer labels fail to capture. Astronomical knowledge appears encoded in Paleolithic artifacts with disturbing frequency. The Blanchard bone plaque, from 25,000 BCE, bears markings that appear to track lunar phases with accuracy, requiring systematic observation. The Abry-Blanchard bone carvings potentially represent star maps. Other artifacts suggest Ice Age peoples tracked celestial movements across generations, accumulating knowledge that supposedly requires settled civilizations with institutional memory. Tool technology demonstrates capabilities inconsistent with simplistic primitiveness. Microblades required advanced knapping techniques mastered through years of practice. Hafted spear points show knowledge of adhesives and composite construction, understanding that different materials bonded together create superior tools. Bone needles with eye holes small enough to thread sinew enabled tailored clothing, which required textile production and complex planning about seasonal needs. The Sungir burials in Russia, dated to 30,000 BCE, reveal social complexity that challenges every assumption about Ice Age egalitarianism. Individuals were buried wearing garments decorated with thousands of mammoth ivory beads. Each bead required hours of careful carving. The complete burial goods represent tens of thousands of labor hours invested in ornamenting single individuals. This indicates specialized labor. Someone spent careers making beads while others provided food, shelter, and protection. It suggests trade networks exchanging valuable materials. It demonstrates social stratification where certain individuals warranted extraordinary burial treatment. Evidence of long-distance trade networks appears throughout Ice Age sites. Baltic amber shows up in Mediterranean excavations. Seashells are found hundreds of miles from coastlines. Obsidian appears far from volcanic source locations. These materials didn't travel by accident. Exchange networks spanning continents operated during the Ice Age, requiring social organization, communication systems, and economic structures supposedly impossible for nomadic hunters. In Eastern Europe, mammoth bone structures demonstrate architectural sophistication that contradicts simple shelter assumptions. Complex circular dwellings constructed from hundreds of mammoth bones required engineering knowledge to create stable structures. They required organized hunting or scavenging to acquire massive quantities of materials. They required coordinated labor to construct dwellings that could house multiple families through brutal Ice Age winters. The symbolic complexity preserved in Ice Age art extends beyond beautiful animals. Abstract geometric patterns appear consistently across cultures and millennia, suggesting sophisticated symbolic thought. Possible counting or calendar systems carved into bones indicate mathematical thinking. Musical instruments, including bone flutes with precise pitch intervals, demonstrate acoustic knowledge and aesthetic sensibilities. Whenever archaeological evidence from the Ice Age undergoes close examination, greater sophistication emerges than expected. The pattern isn't occasional anomaly but consistent revelation. Our assumptions about primitive ancestors are fundamentally wrong. Cave paintings, 30,000 years old, show artistic mastery rivaling Renaissance work. Bone carvings track astronomical cycles. Burial goods suggest trade networks spanning continents. But we're told these people were primitive. But if humans possessed these capabilities 30,000 years ago, what might they have developed by 12,000 BCE when the flood catastrophe occurred? Between the sophisticated Upper Paleolithic cultures creating Chauvet's masterpieces around 30,000 BCE and the sudden appearance of complex societies building Göbekli Tepe around 9600 BCE stretches an enormous gap. 20,000 years. Not decades. Not centuries. 20 millennia during which humans possessed, demonstrated artistic, astronomical, and organizational capabilities, but supposedly accomplished almost nothing worth preserving in the archaeological record. The absence is puzzling. If humans carved Venus figurines, tracked lunar cycles, constructed elaborate dwellings, and maintained continent-spanning trade networks by 30,000 BCE, they had 20,000 years before the Younger Dryas catastrophe to develop further. That's more time than separates us from the earliest Egyptian dynasties. More than enough duration for agriculture to emerge, for architecture to develop, for mathematics and writing, and all the markers we associate with civilization to appear. Yet we find almost nothing from these missing millennia. The standard explanation points to Ice Age conditions making much of Earth uninhabitable. Populations concentrated in specific refugia, isolated pockets of survivable climate. But this explanation creates its own problem. Those refugia would have been coastal areas with maritime resources, fertile river valleys with reliable fresh water, temperate zones where glaciers hadn't advanced. Exactly the areas now hundreds of feet underwater. Post-Ice Age sea level rise drowned the most favorable human habitation zones. If civilizations developed during the missing millennia, their remains rest precisely where archaeological investigation faces maximum difficulty and expense. The catastrophic flooding around 10,900 BCE didn't just raise water levels, it would have destroyed coastal settlements, killed concentrated populations, and disrupted cultural transmission that preserves knowledge across generations. Tantalizing glimpses suggest what might have existed. Göbekli Tepe appears fully formed in 9600 BCE, with no apparent developmental progression. The construction demonstrates sophisticated architectural planning, advanced stoneworking, and organizational capability that should require centuries of learning and refinement. Yet the oldest layers show the same mastery as later ones, suggesting the builders inherited knowledge from elsewhere. From when? Agriculture emerges in multiple locations around 9000 to 8000 BCE, not gradually developing through trial and error, but appearing rapidly as complete packages of domesticated plants. As if populations already knew which plants to cultivate and how to manage them, implementing known techniques rather than discovering them through experimentation. Astronomical knowledge encoded in monuments suggests observations spanning far longer than the structure's ages. The precision requires systematic tracking across many generations, implying observational traditions predating the monuments that eventually encoded the knowledge in stone. But direct evidence from the missing millennia remains frustratingly scarce. The preservation problem explains much of the absence. Wooden structures, textile architecture, plant-based artifacts, and other organic materials that would constitute most of any civilization's material culture simply don't survive tens of thousands of years, except under extraordinary conditions. Stone tools and occasional bone artifacts endure, everything else decays. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence when the evidence type wouldn't survive anyway. Modern hunter-gatherer societies challenge assumptions about what primitive means. Aboriginal Australian cultures maintain sophisticated astronomical knowledge, passed through oral tradition for thousands of years. They practice complex land management systems, including controlled burning, that shapes entire ecosystems. They possess intricate social organizations, kinship networks, and ceremonial structures requiring no agriculture or permanent architecture. Hunter-gatherer doesn't mean incapable of sophisticated culture and accumulated knowledge. Archaeological bias has systematically hidden complexity. Excavations focused on Europe while ignoring potentially richer sites in Asia, Africa, and now submerged continental shelves. Interpretive frameworks dismissed sophisticated artifacts from wrong periods as anomalies, misdated errors, or fraudulent, rather than evidence challenging chronological assumptions. Funding structures directed resources toward studying known civilizations rather than searching unknown regions for unexpected discoveries. Specific contested artifacts from this period hint at lost complexity. The Shigir idol from Siberia, carved from larch wood around 9500 BCE, shows artistic and symbolic sophistication, matching anything from supposedly more advanced later periods. Various megalithic sites tentatively dated beyond 10,000 BCE face dismissal as misdated specifically because they contradict established frameworks. Genetic evidence suggests population bottlenecks and massive migrations around the Younger Dryas period, consistent with civilization collapse, forcing survivors to disperse, carrying fragments of knowledge into scattered refuge zones where they rebuilt from catastrophic loss. The evidence for complex pre-flood civilization remains circumstantial and contested. Many claims are speculative extrapolations from limited data. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence that hasn't yet materialized in forms satisfying mainstream archaeology. But the logical problem persists. Given demonstrated human capability 30,000 years ago and 20,000 subsequent years for development, absence of evidence for increasing complexity during the missing millennia is itself puzzling. Either humans possessed capacity but inexplicably failed to develop despite having time and demonstrated ability, or they did develop complex societies whose evidence was destroyed by catastrophe or remains undiscovered beneath ocean waters. 20,000 years separates Ice Age cave painters from Göbekli Tepe's construction. Enough time for multiple civilizations to rise and fall. Yet we find almost nothing from these missing millennia. But there's one place where evidence of this lost period might have survived encoded in the myths, symbols, and knowledge systems that ancient post-flood cultures preserved. Ancient civilizations claimed they didn't invent their knowledge. They said it was inherited, taught by survivors of a destroyed world, passed down from those who came before the catastrophe that ended the previous age. We dismiss these claims as mythology, but what if their historical memory encoded in narrative form? The astronomical sophistication appearing in early post-flood civilizations suggests knowledge accumulation spanning far longer than those societies existed. Sumerian understanding of planetary cycles required centuries of systematic observation. Egyptian knowledge of precession, the wobble in Earth's axis creating a cycle lasting 26,000 years, required tracking that no single civilization could accomplish within its lifespan. Mayan calendar systems demonstrated precision, requiring observational traditions maintained across many generations. Where did this knowledge originate if these civilizations were supposedly first to achieve complexity? The conventional answer proposes rapid development after agriculture freed humans from subsistence concerns, allowing specialized astronomer priests to begin systematic observation. But this explanation struggles with the sophistication appearing so quickly. The knowledge seems inherited rather than discovered, accumulated over long periods before being encoded in monuments and texts by post-catastrophe cultures. Mathematical knowledge appears with similar suddenness. Sumerian base 60 mathematics shows sophisticated number theory from civilization's earliest documented periods. Egyptian geometric knowledge enabled pyramid construction with precision. Modern engineering struggles to replicate. Various cultures used mathematical constants like pi and phi in architecture, despite supposedly lacking the theoretical mathematics to derive these values independently. Either multiple isolated cultures independently discovered identical mathematical relationships through coincidence, or they inherited knowledge from common source. Mythological narratives preserve what might be historical memory, disguised as divine intervention. Flood myths describe the catastrophe itself. Cultural memory of actual events transmitted through generations until facts became legend. Golden Age narratives describe pre-catastrophe civilizations living in paradise before divine judgment. Culture hero myths tell of gods or advanced beings arriving to teach agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and civilization's other foundations. These might be distorted memories of knowledge inherited from earlier human societies rather than divine revelations. Egyptian tradition claimed their civilization was founded by survivors of a destroyed land. Sumerian king lists describe impossibly long pre-flood reigns, possibly institutional memory of earlier civilizations compressed into mythological framework. Various cultures explicitly stated their knowledge came from before, rather than through independent discovery. We treat these claims as primitive creation mythology, but they consistently describe the same pattern: knowledge inherited from previous age destroyed by catastrophe. Technological capabilities suggest knowledge transmission rather than independent invention. Megalithic construction techniques appear in multiple cultures without clear developmental progression, as if builders knew methods without needing to experiment and refine through trial and error. Metallurgical knowledge emerges in advanced forms, rather than showing gradual development from simple to complex. Agricultural packages, complete suites of domesticated plants and cultivation techniques, appear rapidly, rather than through obvious gradual domestication. The founder civilizations of Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley appear with sophisticated writing, mathematics, astronomy, and architecture already developed. The conventional narrative assumes rapid development once agriculture provided surplus. But the sophistication suggests inheritance. Knowledge preserved through dark ages, following catastrophe, then re-implemented when conditions allowed civilization to rebuild. Catastrophe would filter knowledge predictably. Practical survival knowledge, agriculture, basic construction, toolmaking would be prioritized and preserved. Theoretical knowledge might survive in symbolic or mythological forms, meaning encoded but understanding lost. Specialized knowledge requiring institutional support, advanced astronomy, complex mathematics, sophisticated engineering would be most vulnerable to loss during population collapse and social chaos. This explains the pattern we observe: founder civilizations possessing fundamental knowledge but rebuilding institutional capacity to fully implement it. The inherited knowledge interpretation faces resistance because it challenges civilizational pride. We prefer believing our ancestors invented agriculture, discovered mathematics, developed astronomy through their own genius. Acknowledging inheritance means we might be rediscovering rather than discovering. It suggests human history is more fragile and cyclical than comfortable linear progress narratives allow. The evidence permits, but doesn't require this interpretation. Conventional frameworks strain to explain sophistication without progression, knowledge without apparent source, and consistent narratives of inheritance from those who came before. But alternative explanation remains speculative. Still, the pattern persists. Ancient civilizations didn't claim to have invented their knowledge. They said it was inherited from before the flood, taught by survivors of a destroyed world who carried wisdom into the new age. But there's another form of evidence that's even harder to dismiss: archaeological sites that directly challenge our chronology by dating thousands of years earlier than they should exist. For centuries, locals in West Java, Indonesia, treated the terraced hillside as a sacred site, climbing its stone-covered slopes during pilgrimages without questioning what lay beneath their feet. Gunung Padang appeared to be what everyone assumed it was: a natural geological formation, with some megalithic stone columns arranged on the surface by relatively recent ancestors, perhaps a few thousand years ago. Then, Danny Hillman Natawijaja decided to look deeper. Natawijaja wasn't a fringe researcher chasing alternative theories. He was a respected geologist with Indonesia's Institute of Sciences, equipped with ground-penetrating radar, seismic tomography equipment, and core drilling apparatus. His comprehensive survey of Gunung Padang began as routine archaeological investigation. What he discovered would challenge the entire chronology of human civilization. The radar revealed something impossible. The hill wasn't natural. Beneath the visible surface structures lay multiple layers of artificial construction, extending deep underground, each layer more sophisticated and more ancient than the one above. The surface layer showed megalithic stone columns arranged in terraces, similar to other Indonesian archaeological sites. Carbon dating of organic material trapped in the construction returned dates around 2500 BCE. Interesting but not revolutionary, well within accepted chronology for megalithic cultures in Southeast Asia. The second layer beneath told a different story. More sophisticated construction, larger stones, more complex arrangements. Carbon dating returned dates around 8000 BCE, contemporary with Göbekli Tepe, pushing Indonesian architectural achievement back thousands of years earlier than previously believed. The third layer, deeper still, showed massive columnar structures arranged with geometric precision. The dating returned 13,000 BCE, deeper into the Ice Age, when humans supposedly lacked the organizational capacity for monumental construction. Then came the fourth layer. The deepest accessible level revealed chamber-like structures built with precisely arranged stones, bound together with what appeared to be ancient cement. Radiocarbon analysis of organic material in the binding cement returned dates approaching 20,000 BCE. 20,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum, the coldest period of the Ice Age, when massive glaciers covered continents and scattered human populations supposedly struggled just to survive. Yet here stood evidence of sophisticated architectural construction, deliberate engineering, and technological capability that shouldn't exist for another 15,000 years. If verified, Gunung Padang would become the oldest megalithic structure on Earth by staggering margin. It would predate the Egyptian pyramids by 16,000 years. It would predate Göbekli Tepe by 10,000 years. It would push complex construction back to a period when mainstream archaeology insists humans were primitive hunter-gatherers without agriculture, writing, metallurgy, or the social organization required for monumental building projects. The evidence supporting artificial construction extended beyond dating. Ground-penetrating radar showed regular geometric patterns, inconsistent with natural geological formations. Core samples revealed columnar basalt structures arranged with deliberate air gaps between them, a configuration impossible to occur through natural volcanic processes. The apparent cement binding stones together demonstrated technological sophistication supposedly not developed until civilizations emerged thousands of years later. But the discovery met fierce resistance. The Indonesian government initially supported Natawijaja's research, then mysteriously restricted further excavation. International archaeological community dismissed the findings as misinterpretation of natural geology. Natawijaja faced professional attacks despite his credentials as a respected geologist with decades of experience analyzing similar formations. Critics argued the structures were natural lava columnar formations. They questioned the dating methodology, despite similar techniques being accepted for other sites worldwide. General skepticism greeted the ancient dates, not because evidence was weak, but because implications were too revolutionary to accept comfortably. The site sits on what was once Sundaland, the exposed landmass connecting Indonesia's islands during the Ice Age, before rising seas submerged it. If complex civilization existed on Sundaland 20,000 years ago, it would validate theories that the most advanced Ice Age societies developed in coastal areas now underwater. What makes the resistance particularly revealing is its nature. The site isn't being proven false through excavation and evidence examination. It's being suppressed through funding denial and professional marginalization, preventing the very investigation that could definitively resolve the questions. Ground-penetrating radar shows something impossible beneath an Indonesian hillside. Layer after layer of megalithic construction, with the deepest levels dating to 20,000 years ago, when civilization wasn't supposed to exist. But Indonesia isn't alone. Across the world, sites keep appearing that are far older than accepted chronology permits. The Great Sphinx stares across the Sahara with eyes that might have witnessed rainfall, not the occasional desert storm but sustained precipitation that hasn't fallen on Egypt's plateau for 10,000 years. The weathering patterns carved into the limestone body tell a story conventional Egyptology refuses to hear. Mathematician and Egyptologist R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch first noticed the erosion patterns in the 1950s. The damage didn't match wind and sand abrasion. It matched water erosion, deep vertical fissures created by heavy rainfall over extended periods. Geologist Robert Schoch later conducted extensive analysis confirming Schwaller's observations. Egypt's last period of sustained precipitation ended around 10,000 BCE, thousands of years before the Sphinx was officially dated to 2500 BCE. Either the climate records are wrong, or the dating is wrong, or something carved the Sphinx during an era when civilization wasn't supposed to exist. Mainstream Egyptology maintains the later date, despite geological evidence being difficult to dispute. The Sphinx becomes an anomaly rather than evidence challenging chronology. Nearby at Abydos, the Osirion presents similar problems. This massive megalithic structure uses completely different construction techniques than surrounding New Kingdom buildings. Enormous blocks weighing hundreds of tons were fitted without mortar, bearing no inscriptions or decorations that might definitively date them. The architectural style suggests either much earlier construction or lost building techniques that later Egyptian builders couldn't replicate. South America compounds the pattern. Tiahuanaco in Bolivia sits at 13,000 feet altitude, its massive stone blocks precisely fitted without mortar. Official dating places construction around 500 CE, but researchers arguing for earlier dates point to astronomical alignments, suggesting observation periods spanning thousands of years, and erosion patterns inconsistent with accepted chronology. Puma Punku, also in Bolivia, shows stone-cutting precision that challenges understanding of ancient tool technology. H-blocks weighing tons were carved with such accuracy that surfaces are flat to within fractions of millimeters. The disputed dating and impossible precision create cognitive dissonance between what exists and what supposedly existed in that era. Sacsayhuaman in Peru displays megalithic walls using stones weighing over 200 tons, fitted so precisely that paper cannot slide between blocks. Official attribution to Incan construction faces the problem that Incan masonry, though impressive, shows different techniques and lesser precision than these foundational walls. The megalithic base might incorporate much earlier work that later Incans built upon. Japan's Yonaguni monument rests beneath Pacific waters, at depths corresponding to submersion around 10,000 BCE. The structure shows what appear to be carved steps, flat platforms, and right-angle corners. Geologists debate whether formation is natural or artificial, but the features challenge explanation as purely geological accident. If artificial, it joins underwater structures worldwide in suggesting pre-flood coastal construction. Malta's megalithic temples, officially dated 3600 to 2500 BCE, demonstrate architectural sophistication and astronomical alignments that some researchers argue suggest earlier origins. Carnac in France displays thousands of megalithic standing stones, whose age and purpose remain genuinely mysterious, despite extensive study. Recently discovered underwater structures in the Mediterranean near Greece and elsewhere add to sites challenging conventional chronology. Most remain unexplored, their existence acknowledged, but implications avoided. The Middle East beyond Göbekli Tepe reveals additional pre-agricultural megalithic sites. Karahan Tepe shows similar T-shaped pillars and possibly predates its famous neighbor. Nevali Chori displays comparable construction. Numerous tells throughout the Fertile Crescent have deepest layers, remaining largely unexcavated, potentially hiding even earlier structures. Asia contributes underwater structures off India's coast, ancient ruins in the Gulf of Kambat, and various Southeast Asian sites that standard chronology struggles to accommodate. Common features unite these disparate locations. Massive stone blocks weighing many tons quarried and transported without modern equipment. Construction precision exceeding what accepted tool technology should permit. Astronomical alignments requiring sophisticated observational knowledge. Dating established or contested pushing thousands of years earlier than conventional frameworks allow. The pattern of resistance follows predictable lines. Sites in prestigious locations like Egypt, Greece, and Peru receive grudging acknowledgement, but constant reinterpretation to preserve chronology. Sites in peripheral locations like Indonesia and India face greater dismissal. Sites whose dates would prove most revolutionary receive least funding and most professional skepticism. Some contested sites, may indeed be natural formations misinterpreted as artificial. Some may be younger than alternative researchers claim. Extraordinary chronological claims require rigorous verification beyond what currently exists for many locations. But the accumulation creates its own evidence. Either a global pattern of archaeological misinterpretation is occurring, possible but increasingly implausible as examples multiply, or genuine patterns of ancient megalithic construction exist that chronological frameworks can't to accommodate without fundamental revision. From Egypt to Peru, from Malta to Indonesia, megalithic sites keep challenging our timeline, and the older they're dated, the more fiercely their antiquity is disputed. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence isn't what we've found. It's what's been found and then hidden, dismissed, or explained away when it challenges established chronology too dramatically. In 1936, workers excavating near Baghdad uncovered clay jars that shouldn't have contained what they contained. Inside each jar sat a copper cylinder surrounding an iron rod, sealed with asphalt. The configuration was unmistakable to anyone familiar with basic electrochemistry. A galvanic cell capable of generating electric current. Over a dozen of these devices were found. When modern researchers reconstructed them and filled them with acidic solution, they produced voltage. They worked as batteries. The official response wasn't excitement about advanced ancient technology. It was dismissal. The jars were reinterpreted as storage vessels despite their obvious electrical properties. They were labeled decorative despite their functional design. They became the Baghdad batteries acknowledged to exist, explained away as coincidence, and marginalized because electricity supposedly wasn't harnessed until the 18th century. The pattern was established. Discoveries incompatible with chronology aren't refuted, they're simply dismissed. The Antikythera mechanism followed similar trajectory initially. Recovered from a Roman shipwreck in 1901, the corroded bronze lump was dismissed as a later intrusion having nothing to do with the ancient vessel. Decades passed before X-ray analysis revealed what the corrosion hid. Over 30 precision gear wheels forming an astronomical calculator of extraordinary sophistication. The device tracked solar and lunar cycles, predicted eclipses, and modeled planetary movements with accuracy requiring advanced mathematical and mechanical knowledge. This level of complexity supposedly didn't exist again until 14th century European clockwork mechanisms appeared over 1,000 years later. The Antikythera mechanism couldn't be dismissed because it was physically real, professionally excavated, and definitively dated through shipwreck context. So instead, it forced acknowledgement that ancient technological sophistication exceeded all assumptions, but it remains treated as unique anomaly rather than example of capabilities that might have been widespread. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, shows the Antarctic coastline with details matching modern surveys of the landmass beneath the ice. The map couldn't result from 15th century exploration. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820. The coastline shown is ice-free, requiring either mapping during pre-Ice Age periods when the coast was exposed or sophisticated Antarctic exploration centuries before official discovery. Explanations range from lucky guessing to misinterpretation to compilation from lost ancient maps. But conventional history never fully explains how a 16th century map contains information supposedly unknowable until modern times. The Dropa stones present more controversial case. Hundreds of disc-shaped stones discovered in Chinese mountains in 1938 bore tiny hieroglyphs telling stories of spacecraft crashes and ancient visitors. The Chinese Academy of Sciences initially investigated, then classified the findings and suppressed further research. Subsequently, the entire discovery was dismissed as hoax, despite physical artifacts existing in museum collections. Whether genuine or fraudulent, the case demonstrates how potentially revolutionary implications lead to professional dismissal, regardless of evidence examination. The Michigan relics, thousands of artifacts discovered in the late 19th century, showing apparent connections between ancient American and Mediterranean civilizations, faced wholesale dismissal. Some were likely fraudulent. But wholesale rejection of the entire collection served to preserve the narrative of pre-Columbian American isolation. Genuine artifacts were discarded with fraudulent ones to protect chronological assumptions. The Texas footprint, a fossilized human footprint found inside a fossilized dinosaur footprint in the Paluxy River, suggests either fraudulent carving or catastrophic chronological problems. Investigation focused on dismissal rather than explanation. The anomaly was handled through professional marginalization rather than serious examination. The pattern becomes clear across these cases. Discoveries marginally challenging chronology by a few centuries receive eventual acknowledgement and integration. Discoveries moderately challenging chronology by thousands of years face intense scrutiny and are accepted only with overwhelming evidence. But discoveries fundamentally challenging chronology by 10,000 or more years, or suggesting advanced technology in supposedly primitive periods, are systematically dismissed, regardless of evidence quality. They're not refuted through investigation. They're professionally marginalized through labeling as out-of-place artifacts, a classification that automatically renders them problematic rather than potentially revolutionary. Discoverers' credentials get attacked rather than evidence examined. Findings that don't fit simply get ignored, ensuring they never enter textbooks, museums, or public awareness. Genuine frauds exist. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But justified skepticism creates systematic filters, preventing paradigm-challenging evidence from ever receiving fair examination, protecting orthodox chronology while potentially suppressing genuine discoveries that could revolutionize historical understanding. Some discoveries are so incompatible with accepted history that they're not refuted or debunked. They're simply dismissed, ignored, and erased from the official record. But beyond specific artifacts and sites, there's broader evidence from human genetics, linguistics, and climate science that supports the pre-flood civilization hypothesis. Every human alive today carries evidence of catastrophe encoded in their DNA. The signature is unmistakable to geneticists who know how to read it. A bottleneck, a moment when human populations crashed to numbers so small that genetic diversity plummeted, leaving mathematical scars in our genome that persist 11,000 years later. Genetic bottlenecks occur when populations are reduced to small numbers. The fewer individuals surviving, the less genetic variation continues into subsequent generations. The effect leaves detectable patterns, specific markers, reduced diversity in certain gene regions, timing signatures that can be dated through molecular clock analysis. Human genetic studies reveal multiple bottlenecks in our species' history. The most severe occurred around 70,000 BCE, possibly associated with the Toba supereruption that nearly drove humanity to extinction. But another significant reduction appears around 12,000 to 10,000 BCE, coinciding precisely with the Younger Dryas period. The timing isn't coincidental. Human populations that had been expanding and diversifying during the warming period, from 15,000 to 13,000 BCE, experienced sudden reduction. Genetic diversity decreased dramatically. Surviving populations show geographic restriction concentrated in specific refugia rather than distributed across continents, as they had been previously. Then, around 10,000 to 8,000 BCE, populations began expanding again from these isolated locations. But the genetic patterns differ from pre-bottleneck populations. The diversity that existed before was partly lost, replaced by new patterns reflecting which specific groups survived and where they survived. The genetic data maps to geography in revealing ways. Certain haplogroups, genetic lineages traced through either maternal mitochondrial DNA or paternal Y chromosomes, show radiation from specific refugia around 10,000 to 8,000 BCE. The pattern suggests small populations surviving catastrophe in isolated locations, then expanding as climate stabilized and resources became available. Previously, large populations were suddenly reduced and geographically restricted. The signature matches what catastrophic collapse would create. Consider what this means for pre-flood civilization theories. If complex societies had developed during 15,000 to 13,000 BCE, after the last glacial maximum ended, but before the Younger Dryas catastrophe, the genetic bottleneck, around 10,900 BCE, would represent their destruction. Small surviving populations in mountain refugia or isolated coastal zones might have carried knowledge forward but lacked the population size and resources to maintain civilizational complexity immediately after catastrophe. Subsequent population expansion represents survivors rebuilding, not humans first achieving civilization. Mitochondrial DNA studies show population expansions from bottlenecks precisely around 10,000 BCE. Y chromosome studies reveal similar patterns of reduction followed by expansion. Whole genome analyses identify selection events during this period. Genetic changes possibly representing survival advantages in catastrophic conditions when only certain traits enabled survival through climate chaos and resource collapse. The genetic evidence correlates disturbingly well with archaeological patterns. Agriculture appears around 9000 to 8000 BCE, not as gradual development, but as rapid implementation across multiple regions. The pattern matches survivors applying known techniques in new environments rather than independently discovering farming through trial and error. Settled communities emerge in multiple locations simultaneously, rather than diffusing from single source. The distribution suggests knowledge existed before catastrophe, carried by different survivor groups to different regions. Sophisticated astronomical and mathematical knowledge appears in early civilizations, without apparent development time. The capability matches inheritance from pre-bottleneck populations rather than independent invention. Mainstream geneticists acknowledge the bottlenecks, but attribute them purely to climate change and resource stress. The correlation with archaeological anomalies gets dismissed as coincidence. Alternative interpretations, suggesting complex pre-bottleneck societies, face marginalization as speculative overreach. But genetic evidence carries particular weight. Unlike artifacts that can be dismissed or reinterpreted, genetic data is mathematical and replicable. The bottleneck timing is independently verified across multiple studies, using different methodologies and examining different genetic markers. The precision is too exact to easily dismiss. The correlation with geological catastrophe timing, Younger Dryas impact, meltwater pulses, abrupt climate disruption aligns within centuries. Genetic collapse, geological catastrophe, archaeological disruption, mythological memory, all pointing to the same moment. Genetic bottlenecks don't prove advanced civilizations existed. They prove only that populations were severely reduced. The relationship between population size and civilization complexity isn't straightforward. Small populations can maintain sophisticated knowledge if conditions permit. But the pattern converges. Genetic evidence combined with archaeological, geological, and mythological evidence creates convergence, increasingly difficult to explain through conventional frameworks that insist nothing complex existed before the catastrophe. Our DNA tells a story of catastrophe. Around 10,900 BCE, human populations crashed. Genetic diversity plummeted. Small groups of survivors began rebuilding from isolated refugia, exactly when the flood myths say the world was destroyed. But genetics isn't the only biological evidence. Language, diversity, and distribution patterns tell a similar story of catastrophic disruption and population movements around the same period. Languages evolve at measurable rates. Pronunciation shifts, vocabulary changes, grammar structures transform across generations. By analyzing these changes, linguists can reconstruct proto-languages, the ancestral forms from which modern language families descended, and date when populations speaking those languages separated and began independent evolution. The deeper the divergence between related languages, the longer ago their speakers separated. When linguists trace major language families back through time, a pattern emerges. The divergences cluster around a specific period, 10,000 to 8,000 BCE. The timing coincides precisely with the genetic bottleneck, the Younger Dryas catastrophe, and the flood narratives preserved in mythology. Indo-European languages spanning from Iceland to India show common origin around 6,000 to 4,000 BCE. But deeper analysis reveals earlier proto-language roots, suggesting the family's ultimate origins reach back further, possibly to survivor populations after the Younger Dryas. Afro-Asiatic languages diverged around 10,000 BCE. Sino-Tibetan, Austronesian, and other major families show similar divergence dating. The pattern suggests populations that had been in contact, sharing linguistic features through trade, migration, or cultural exchange, became suddenly separated and began independent evolution. The timing is precise. Major language family divergences occur exactly when genetic evidence shows population bottlenecks and dispersal, when geological evidence documents catastrophic climate disruption, when flood myths describe world destruction. What could cause simultaneous linguistic divergence across the globe? Catastrophic population reduction would do it. If large interconnected populations were suddenly decimated, with small survivor groups dispersing into isolated refugia, those groups would carry fragments of earlier linguistic unity. Over subsequent millennia of isolation, those fragments would evolve into distinct language families, showing evidence of common origin but profound divergence. The rapid divergence patterns match refugee populations dispersing from catastrophe zones into previously uninhabited or sparsely inhabited regions. Geographic barriers that didn't matter when populations were large and mobile would become insurmountable when small survivor groups struggled just to maintain subsistence. Ancient language reconstruction reveals sophisticated vocabulary appearing early in language histories. Abstract concepts, complex social organization, technological terminology, the linguistic evidence suggests speakers possessed cultural complexity from the earliest reconstructible periods rather than gradually developing it. Shared mythological and cosmological vocabulary appears across language families, despite geographic and temporal separation. The common terminology suggests cultural source predating family divergence, knowledge inherited from before the split rather than independently developed afterward. Linguistic evidence for long-distance trade and cultural exchange appears earlier than archaeological evidence alone would suggest. The vocabulary exists before physical artifacts clearly document the activities the words describe. Controversial linguistic hypotheses attempt to explain these patterns. Nostratic macrofamily theories propose that major language families, Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic, Dravidian, Uralic, and others derive from common source around 15,000 to 12,000 BCE. The proposals face fierce resistance from conservative historical linguists who consider deep time reconstruction too speculative. But if accepted, Nostratic proto-language timing places it precisely in the pre-flood period. The common source would represent speech of populations before catastrophe. The divergence would represent survivor dispersal. Place name evidence adds another layer. Ancient toponyms preserve linguistic forms from earlier populations. Substrate languages remain visible in borrowed words and names within historically dominant languages. Archaic place names often mark sacred or important sites, possibly preserving pre-catastrophe geographic knowledge in linguistic form. The flood vocabulary pattern is particularly striking. Remarkably similar words for flood, deluge, or great water appear in unrelated language families, separated by oceans and millennia. The linguistic similarity exceeds what pure chance would predict. Either this represents archetypal metaphor, emerging independently possible, but statistically unlikely given the precision or shared experience. Cultural memory of actual catastrophe preserved in vocabulary even as speakers dispersed and languages diverged. Mainstream historical linguistics remains conservative about deep time reconstruction. The uncertainty increases exponentially the further back analysis reaches. Macro-family proposals face skepticism, and many linguists reject them entirely. The idea that linguistic patterns reflect civilization collapse, rather than pure migration without catastrophe, remains marginalized. But the evidence corroborates genetic and archaeological patterns. Major disruption around 10,000 BCE, involving population movements, cultural discontinuity, and subsequent divergence. The convergence matches catastrophe, destroying complex societies and dispersing survivors who carried fragments of earlier cultures into geographically separated regions where languages evolved independently. Language families diverged around 10,000 BCE, spreading from specific regions as if populations were fleeing something. And many preserved the same word, flood. But perhaps the most direct evidence comes from the survivors themselves, the post-catastrophe civilizations that emerged around 9000 BCE, and what they said about where their knowledge came from. The Sumerian king lists present a problem for anyone assuming ancient texts contain only mythology. The lists document rulers with regnal lengths, 8 years, 12 years, 43 years, believable human lifespans for historical kings. Then the lists describe rulers before the flood, with impossibly long reigns, tens of thousands of years, times when kingship came down from heaven, before catastrophe destroyed everything. Scholars dismiss these sections as purely mythological, but the specificity is troubling. Why transition from mythological time to historical time precisely at the flood? Why mark that event as the boundary between ages? The Eridu Genesis describes gods deciding to destroy humanity through deluge, with one survivor preserving life. The narrative parallels later biblical accounts, but predates them by centuries. The text treats the flood not as metaphor but as historical event dividing eras. Egyptian temple texts describe civilization founded by survivors from a destroyed land. They call this earlier time Zep Tepi, the first time when gods or deified ancestors taught agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and writing. The consistent narrative claims Egyptian knowledge was inherited and preserved, rather than originated through independent discovery. The implication challenges cultural pride. Claiming to have invented knowledge glorifies a civilization. Claiming to have merely preserved it from earlier sources suggests something greater existed before. Yet this is what Egyptian sources consistently say. Chinese legends describe the Yellow Emperor and cultural heroes bringing civilization after catastrophic flooding. Earlier ages were destroyed by water. Knowledge transmission occurred from earlier periods rather than through independent invention. The pattern mirrors Sumerian and Egyptian accounts, despite geographic and cultural separation. Indian Vedas and Puranas describe previous yugas ages destroyed by various catastrophes including flooding. Rishis and devas preserved knowledge across world-ending events. The texts detail prior civilizations with different characteristics than the current age. They treat cyclical destruction and renewal as historical pattern rather than pure mythology. Mesoamerican sources tell similar stories. Aztec legends describe multiple world ages, suns destroyed by various catastrophes, with the current age being the fifth Sunday. Mayan texts describe previous creations destroyed by flood. Current civilization arose from survivors of previous world destruction. The geographic and cultural isolation makes the pattern remarkable. These civilizations had no apparent contact during their formative periods, yet tell fundamentally similar stories about their origins. Plato's Atlantis narrative explicitly describes advanced civilization destroyed by catastrophe approximately 9,000 years before Solon's time, placing the destruction around 11,500 years ago from present. Plato claimed this came from Egyptian priestly records, not philosophical imagination. He insisted it was historical account, not allegory. Scholars dismiss it as philosophical fiction, despite Plato's explicit claims to the contrary. The pattern across cultures is consistent. Ancient civilizations claimed their knowledge was inherited rather than discovered. They described previous world ages destroyed by catastrophe, particularly flooding. They identified specific cultural heroes or gods who transmitted knowledge from the previous age. They treated this knowledge as precious inheritance, requiring protection and preservation. Mainstream scholarship handles these accounts through reflexive dismissal. They're mythology without historical content. They represent psychological archetypes or seasonal flood metaphors. The possibility they preserve distorted but genuine historical memory receives minimal serious consideration. But internal evidence suggests historical core beneath mythological elaboration. Specific details serve no obvious mythological or moral purpose, but appear informational. The consistency across isolated cultures exceeds what coincidence would predict. The correlation with geological and genetic evidence of catastrophe around the claimed timing is precise, and claiming inherited rather than originated knowledge actually diminishes cultural pride rather than enhancing it. Why would civilizations consistently make claims that reduce their achievement unless those claims reflected genuine memory? The uncomfortable question persists. If ancient civilizations consistently claim to inherit knowledge from earlier, destroyed civilizations, and if geological, genetic, and archaeological evidence increasingly supports catastrophic events, destroying whatever existed before 10,000 BCE, at what point does scholarly responsibility require investigating whether these accounts contain historical truth? Ancient accounts combine historical memory with mythological elaboration. Cultural memory across 10,000 years inevitably distorts details. Claims require verification through physical evidence. But the consistent pattern of inheritance claims, combined with accumulating evidence for catastrophe and unexpected sophistication before civilization's supposed beginning, suggests these accounts deserve serious investigation rather than automatic dismissal. Ancient civilizations didn't claim to have invented their knowledge. From Egypt to China to Mesoamerica, they said the same thing. It was inherited from those who came before the flood. So if the evidence points toward pre-flood civilizations, and ancient peoples said this is what happened, why does mainstream archaeology so fiercely resist these conclusions? Consider the infrastructure built on current chronology. Thousands of textbooks present the standard timeline to millions of students. Museum displays organize human history around conventional periodization. University curricula structure archaeology programs by established frameworks. Academic positions exist specifically to study particular periods defined by current paradigm. The investment is staggering. Revising civilization's timeline by 10,000 years wouldn't require minor corrections. It would demand complete reconstruction of educational and institutional architecture built over more than a century. Every textbook would need rewriting, not updated rewritten from foundation. Every museum exhibit would require fundamental reorganization, not just new labels but reconceptualized narratives about human development. University courses would demand restructuring, not tweaking syllabi, but rebuilding curricula around different chronological assumptions. And countless academic careers built on current frameworks would face obsolescence. Individual archaeologists aren't villains protecting lies. They're professionals who invested decades mastering frameworks that organize their field. They built expertise within paradigms that define legitimate questions and acceptable answers. They established careers based on current understanding, publishing papers that assume orthodox chronology, earning tenure by demonstrating mastery of conventional interpretation. Admitting fundamental error would invalidate life's work for many scholars. The human cost of paradigm shift is real and personal. It's why resistance operates through normal professional mechanisms rather than conscious conspiracy. Peer review systems create conformity pressure automatically. Reviewers share the same training and assumptions as authors they evaluate. Papers challenging fundamental chronology face reviewers invested in defending frameworks the papers question. Revolutionary claims receive heightened scrutiny while confirmatory findings pass easily through review. The system isn't designed to suppress truth. It's designed to maintain quality control. But when the quality standards assume current paradigm correctness, the effect is suppression of paradigm-challenging evidence regardless of merit. Funding structures direct research grants toward questions fitting existing frameworks. Grant proposals must convince reviewers the research is important and feasible. Challenging fundamental chronology makes proposals seem speculative rather than rigorous, fringe rather than serious. Revolutionary inquiry starves, while conventional research receives support. Publication bias favors incremental findings over paradigm-challenging discoveries. Journals prefer articles that advance understanding within accepted frameworks, rather than articles questioning the frameworks themselves. Revolutionary papers face rejection, not because evidence is weak, but because implications are too radical. Career advancement requires conformity to consensus. Tenure committees evaluate candidates based on publication records, grant funding, and professional standing. Scholars proposing revolutionary chronologies risk all three. They publish in marginal venues because mainstream journals reject their work. They receive limited funding because grant committees consider their research speculative. They face professional isolation because establishment figures distance themselves from controversial colleagues. The message is clear: challenge the framework at your professional peril. Specialization creates additional barriers. Archaeology divides into geographic and temporal domains. Egyptian archaeology, Mesopotamian archaeology, Paleolithic archaeology. Scholars master narrow specializations, rarely communicating across domains. Evidence challenging chronology requires integrating findings across specializations, but institutional structure inhibits synthesis. Revolutionary insights often come from generalists or outsiders, precisely because specialists are trapped in narrow expertise. The archaeological site permit system operates as gatekeeping mechanism. Governments control access to sites, granting permits to researchers proposing conventional interpretations. Scholars suggesting revolutionary dating or alternative interpretations face permit denial. The effect ensures only orthodox research occurs at important sites, preventing investigation that might generate paradigm-challenging evidence. Publication control reinforces the pattern. Prestigious journals reject papers challenging fundamental chronology, regardless of evidence quality. Authors learn to self-censor, framing findings conservatively to ensure publication. Revolutionary discoveries get relegated to fringe presses, where they can be dismissed as not serious scholarship. The circular logic is perfect. Only conventional findings appear in conventional venues, then unconventional findings are dismissed for not appearing in conventional venues. None of this requires conspiracy. No evil cabal meets secretly to suppress truth. These are normal institutional operations that collectively create effective suppression of paradigm-challenging evidence. The parallel to other scientific revolutions is instructive. Continental drift was dismissed for decades despite evidence. Heliocentrism faced resistance despite mathematical superiority. countless examples show institutional investment in existing paradigms, delaying recognition of revolutionary truth. Understanding these mechanisms doesn't require cynicism about individual scholars. It requires sophisticated understanding of how institutions preserve themselves, even when evidence suggests they need fundamental revision. Acknowledging pre-flood civilizations would require rewriting every textbook, reorganizing every museum, and admitting that careers built over decades were based on fundamentally wrong chronology. That's not a conspiracy. That's institutional self-preservation. But beyond institutions protecting themselves, are there deeper ideological reasons why pre-flood civilizations are so threatening to acknowledge? Modern Western civilization tells itself a comforting story about progress. Humanity began primitive and gradually advanced through stages: hunter-gatherers to farmers, villages to cities, superstition to science. Modernity represents the pinnacle, the greatest achievement of human development after millennia of steady improvement. This narrative isn't just academic framework. It's foundational mythology, justifying contemporary institutions, economic systems, and power structures. Acknowledging that civilizations 12,000 years ago possessed sophisticated knowledge and capabilities shatters this mythology. If ancient peoples achieved architectural, astronomical, and organizational sophistication, rivaling or exceeding modern capabilities in those domains, then progress isn't linear. Advancement isn't inevitable. And modernity isn't humanity's first or necessarily greatest achievement. The psychological resistance runs deep. We prefer discovering to rediscovering. We prefer believing our ancestors were primitive rather than acknowledging they possessed knowledge we've lost. The alternative suggests human history is cyclical rather than progressive. Civilizations rise, achieve sophistication, then collapse into darkness before the cycle repeats. That's existentially unsettling. Religious chronologies create additional barriers. Biblical timelines place creation around 4000 BCE and Noah's flood around 2300 BCE. These dates cannot accommodate geological flooding at 10,900 BCE or sophisticated civilizations existing 12,000 years ago. Acknowledging ancient pre-flood civilizations requires either rejecting literal biblical interpretation or fundamentally revising religious chronology. Institutional religious organizations wield significant power over archaeological interpretation, funding, and education. The pressure to maintain compatibility with religious narratives shapes what research receives support and what findings receive acknowledgement. Colonial legacy haunts archaeology's foundations. 19th and 20th century European archaeology developed during colonialism, shaped by ideologies positioning European civilization as superior evolutionary achievement. The field's basic assumptions reflected racialized hierarchies, where non-European peoples were considered less capable, less advanced, less worthy of serious study. Acknowledging that ancient non-European civilizations in Turkey, Indonesia, India, South America possessed sophisticated capabilities challenges these hierarchies. It requires confronting the uncomfortable recognition that archaeology's foundational assumptions were shaped by now discredited ideologies that continue influencing contemporary interpretations. Modern civilization views itself as exceptional, unprecedented in human history. This exceptionalism provides psychological comfort and justifies contemporary power structures. Acknowledging cyclical civilizational rise and fall suggests we're not special but rather experiencing a pattern that has occurred before, and might occur again. The existential anxiety this creates about modernity's fragility and potential for collapse drives resistance to acknowledging pre-flood civilizations. If sophisticated societies existed before and collapsed catastrophically, what prevents similar collapse of contemporary civilization? The question is too threatening to examine comfortably. Modern culture invests enormous faith in expert knowledge and scientific authority. Acknowledging that experts can be systematically wrong about fundamental questions not through malice but through institutional and ideological bias threatens broader trust in expertise. The resistance protects not just archaeological frameworks but the entire architecture of institutional authority. Admitting error in one domain raises questions about reliability in others. Determining where humanity came from and when civilization began is fundamentally about identity and meaning. Institutions controlling historical narratives wield significant cultural power. They define what counts as legitimate heritage, whose ancestors receive recognition, and which origin stories get taught to children. Revising civilization's origins transfers authority from established institutions to new interpretive frameworks. This represents power shift that many resist regardless of evidence. Western archaeological institutions have controlled interpretation of global ancient sites for over a century, often ignoring or minimizing indigenous accounts of their own history. Acknowledging pre-flood civilizations frequently requires taking seriously the oral traditions and origin accounts of non-Western peoples that academia has systematically dismissed as mythology. The uncomfortable recognition that indigenous knowledge about the past might be more accurate than Western archaeological interpretation threatens established hierarchies of expertise and cultural authority. Geology and archaeology developed during the 19th century, specifically rejecting catastrophism in favor of uniformitarianism, the principle that geological and historical change occurs gradually through processes still operating today. Acknowledging that catastrophic events shaped human history requires rehabilitating previously rejected theoretical frameworks. The institutional resistance reflects unwillingness to admit that foundational methodological assumptions might have been wrong from the beginning. These aren't necessarily conscious calculations. They're deep-seated assumptions shaping how evidence is interpreted, what questions are asked, and what answers are considered acceptable. Ideology operates subtly, not through obvious censorship, but through shaping what seems plausible, what evidence is noticed, and what interpretations feel intuitively correct. Acknowledging pre-flood civilizations doesn't just challenge academic careers. It threatens the progress narrative, religious chronologies, and the comforting belief that modernity represents humanity's first and greatest achievement. But despite institutional and ideological resistance, the evidence continues accumulating, and a new generation of researchers is beginning to challenge orthodox chronology. Göbekli Tepe changed something fundamental. When the site couldn't be denied or dismissed, when the dating proved incontrovertible and the sophistication undeniable, mainstream archaeology faced a choice: revise chronology or lose credibility. It chose revision. Reluctantly, incrementally, but revision nonetheless. The precedent mattered. Once mainstream archaeology acknowledged that complex societies existed thousands of years earlier than previously accepted, subsequent ancient dating claims became less automatically dismissible. The wall protecting orthodox chronology developed its first significant crack. Younger scholars trained after Göbekli Tepe's revelation are less invested in defending old chronology. They didn't build careers on frameworks the site challenges. They learned archaeology in a discipline already forced to acknowledge it had been wrong about when complex construction began. This makes them more open to considering they might be wrong about other dates too. Academic attitudes are shifting, slowly but measurably, increasing acceptance of sophisticated Paleolithic culture, growing recognition that hunter-gatherer societies could achieve architectural and organizational complexity without agriculture or permanent settlement, emerging willingness to consider earlier dates for various ancient sites without scholars facing automatic professional destruction. The change is glacial. But glaciers do move. Technology accelerates the shift. Ground-penetrating radar reveals structures invisible to traditional excavation. LiDAR penetrates jungle canopy to map ancient cities conventional archaeology never knew existed. Satellite imaging identifies potential sites across vast areas impossible to survey on foot. These technologies are increasingly accessible to independent researchers, not just establishment institutions. The democratization of evidence through publicly available satellite imagery and digital databases enables crowdsourced discovery and verification. Control over evidence is slipping from institutional gatekeepers. Independent researchers remain controversial. Many are dismissed as pseudo-archaeologists. Some deserve dismissal. Their claims are unsupported, speculation, or deliberate fraud. But others are making genuine contributions that establishment archaeology must eventually acknowledge. Successful independent researchers are increasingly credentialed, bringing relevant expertise from adjacent fields. Geologists analyzing archaeological sites, engineers evaluating ancient construction techniques, data scientists applying statistical methods to dating and analysis. The line between amateur and professional archaeology blurs as technology enables sophisticated investigation outside institutional settings. Recent developments signal broader acceptance. Mainstream archaeology increasingly acknowledges underwater archaeological potential, not just for recent shipwrecks, but for Ice Age settlements now submerged. Growing recognition that climate catastrophe at the Younger Dryas boundary had major civilizational impacts. Emerging acceptance that ancient astronomical knowledge was more sophisticated than previously credited. These aren't revolutionary admissions yet, but they're shifts that would have been professionally impossible 2 decades ago. Generational change matters profoundly. Older scholars deeply invested in orthodox chronology are retiring. Their replacement by younger scholars facing less pressure to defend frameworks they didn't create accelerates potential for revision. Younger archaeologists have less reputational investment in maintaining chronologies established before they entered the field. Increasing diversity of archaeological practice contributes to change. More women, more scholars from previously colonized regions, more interdisciplinary approaches. Each brings perspectives challenging the field's traditional assumptions shaped by earlier demographics and power structures. The funding landscape shifts, though funding remains limited. Some private foundations are beginning to support alternative chronology research. Crowdfunding enables investigation of sites mainstream institutions ignore. Archaeological funding is so scarce that unconventional sources increasingly matter, creating space for research establishment institutions wouldn't support. Publication barriers are weakening. Top-tier journals remain conservative, but mid-tier and interdisciplinary journals show more openness to revolutionary findings. Open access publishing reduces gatekeeping power. Preliminary findings published online before formal publication enable rapid dissemination and community evaluation, circumventing traditional control mechanisms. Public interest creates pressure institutions cannot completely ignore. Documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube content about alternative archaeology reach audiences numbering in millions. Public fascination creates pressure on institutions to engage with questions they'd prefer to dismiss. The economic reality that museums and universities increasingly depend on public support makes complete dismissal of public interests costly. The combination of technological capabilities, generational change, public pressure, and accumulating anomalous evidence creates conditions where fundamental chronological revision might become possible within coming decades. Paradigm shifts are slow. Institutional resistance remains powerful. Most mainstream archaeology still operates within orthodox frameworks, but the walls protecting old chronology are beginning to crack. New technology, younger scholars, accumulating evidence. These are slowly forcing mainstream archaeology to acknowledge what was once forbidden. Human civilization is far older than we've been taught. But whether mainstream archaeology acknowledges it or not, the implications of pre-flood civilizations extend far beyond academic debates. They fundamentally change how we understand ourselves and our future. The evidence suggests a pattern. Sophisticated civilizations developed over thousands of years. They possessed knowledge systems enabling astronomical precision, architectural capabilities moving multi-ton stones with techniques we struggle to replicate, and organizational complexity coordinating hundreds or thousands of people toward shared goals. Then catastrophic events destroyed them so completely that we're only now recovering fragmentary evidence they existed at all. Modern civilization assumes permanence. We plan as if our technological society will continue progressing indefinitely. We store accumulated knowledge in digital systems and global institutions we treat as secure. We design infrastructure assuming stable climate, reliable supply chains, and functioning social institutions. Yet geological and archaeological evidence suggests civilizational destruction and knowledge loss is the historical norm, not the exception. Our vulnerabilities are specific and terrifying when examined honestly. Technological infrastructure depends on complex global supply chains. Disruption in one region cascades through systems worldwide. A pandemic affecting key production centers can halt manufacturing globally, as COVID-19 demonstrated with relatively mild disruption compared to what's possible. Our knowledge increasingly exists in digital formats, requiring functioning electrical grids and compatible hardware. A major electromagnetic pulse, whether from solar flare or artificial weapon, could destroy electrical infrastructure globally. Within weeks, most digital knowledge would become inaccessible. Within years, without functioning computers to read deteriorating storage media, it would be permanently lost. Specialization means few individuals possess comprehensive knowledge of critical systems. Engineers understand narrow domains. Farmers depend on industrial supply chains for seeds, fertilizers, and equipment they don't know how to produce themselves. Medical professionals rely on pharmaceutical industries and diagnostic technologies they can't replicate independently. If systems collapse, specialized knowledge disappears with the specialists who die without successfully training successors. Just-in-time economic systems have minimal resilience to shock. Cities contain food supplies lasting days, not months. Medicine stockpiles are limited. Fuel reserves are calculated for efficiency rather than emergency. The optimization that makes modern economies productive makes them fragile. A series of crop failures due to climate disruption could generate mass starvation. Cascading financial crisis could eliminate monetary systems, enabling modern exchange. Combination of multiple stresses, pandemic, climate disaster, economic collapse, social conflict, could trigger systemic failure beyond any single system's ability to prevent or repair. Archaeological evidence suggests such catastrophes have occurred before. Knowledge loss follows predictable progression when civilizations collapse. Writing systems are forgotten within generations if not actively taught. Technological capabilities are lost when practitioners die without apprentices. Scientific knowledge deteriorates to ritual and superstition when theoretical frameworks enabling understanding are lost. Material culture deteriorates to raw materials when maintenance systems fail. This explains why so little survives from pre-flood civilizations, despite their apparent sophistication. First, specialized knowledge disappeared as experts died during catastrophe. Then, practical knowledge eroded as survival took priority over scholarship. Material artifacts deteriorated without maintenance. Finally, only oral traditions and megalithic constructions survived exactly the pattern we see in the archaeological record. Consider the uncomfortable parallel. If we discovered ruins of our current civilization 10,000 years from now, much would be unrecognizable or misinterpreted. Our greatest technological achievements, computers, satellites, complex machinery, would leave little trace after millennia of corrosion and decay. Plastics would degrade, metals would rust, concrete would crumble, glass would shatter. The massive infrastructure we consider permanent would weather to scattered foundations and ambiguous debris. Future archaeologists might find those foundations and wonder how primitive people moved such large stones without understanding the sophisticated civilization that created them. Exactly how we view pre-flood civilizations whose knowledge we've lost. Understanding civilizational fragility should inform how we store knowledge, design, infrastructure, and plan for potential catastrophes. Archaeological evidence provides case studies in civilizational collapse and knowledge loss that might help us avoid similar fates. Recognizing that we're not the first sophisticated civilization should generate humility about our assumed permanence. Civilizations do collapse. Knowledge is routinely lost. Assuming contemporary civilization is exempt from patterns affecting all previous societies is hubris rather than wisdom. The geological record documents catastrophes that would overwhelm modern response capabilities. The archaeological record shows civilizations destroyed despite their sophistication. The genetic record reveals population bottlenecks reducing humanity to small surviving groups. These aren't ancient curiosities. They're warnings about patterns that could repeat. If our civilization collapsed today, 10,000 years from now, archaeologists would find scattered megalithic foundations and wonder how primitive people moved such stones. Exactly how we view the pre-flood civilizations whose knowledge we've lost. But if civilizations have collapsed before, what can we learn from their experiences to increase our own chances of survival? Pre-flood civilizations that left traces made specific choices, enabling some knowledge to survive catastrophe. Those choices weren't accidental. They built in stone rather than perishable materials, ensuring key structures would outlast civilizational collapse. They encoded knowledge redundantly across multiple sites and media, preventing single-point failure from erasing everything. They created initiation systems and oral traditions, ensuring knowledge passed through catastrophe via human carriers. They embedded information in monuments, astronomical alignments, and symbols that could be rediscovered even if cultural context was lost. These strategies worked. We found the monuments. We're deciphering the alignments. We're beginning to understand the symbols. Megalithic construction preserves spatial relationships and astronomical alignments that communicate across millennia. The stones at Göbekli Tepe tell us their builders understood geometry, tracked celestial movements, and possessed organizational sophistication knowledge, surviving 11,000 years without writing, without digital storage, without any technology we consider advanced. Just stone, carefully placed, deliberately carved, astronomically aligned. The durability is instructive. Our most sophisticated storage technologies, hard drives, SSDs, cloud servers, require specific hardware and software to access. They fail within years or decades without active maintenance. Stone monuments endure for millennia, requiring no maintenance, no compatible technology, no specialized knowledge to recognize they exist. Oral traditions maintained narratives across generations without writing. Aboriginal Australian cultures preserved accurate geographic knowledge for over 10,000 years through oral transmission knowledge, recently verified by comparing traditional accounts to geological evidence of coastline configurations. Before sea level rise, the transmission succeeded where written records would have failed. Languages change, scripts become undecipherable, and documents decay. But stories told generation to generation adapt to linguistic evolution while preserving core information. Ritual and religion, encoded practical knowledge, informs surviving cultural transformation. Agricultural calendars embedded in religious festivals ensured planting knowledge transmitted even if understanding of underlying astronomy was lost. Construction techniques preserved through ritual reenactment maintained capabilities across periods when theoretical knowledge disappeared. Modern society dismisses these methods as primitive, but they've proven effective across time spans, dwarfing our technological civilization's existence. How should we store critical knowledge to survive potential civilizational collapse? Digital storage is efficient, but fragile and technology-dependent. Perhaps we need physical archives in geologically stable locations, stone tablets, metal plates, materials lasting millennia without active preservation. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault implements this principle, preserving crop diversity in permafrost against catastrophe. The Long Now Foundation develops projects for extremely long-term knowledge preservation. Various initiatives store human knowledge in durable physical formats designed to survive civilizational collapse. These aren't paranoid preparations. They're realistic acknowledgement that civilizations have collapsed before and might collapse again. How do we ensure knowledge transmits to future generations? Formal education is vulnerable to institutional collapse. Schools require stable societies, trained teachers, and economic surplus supporting scholarship. When civilizations collapse, formal education disappears within one generation. Perhaps we need multiple transmission modes, including oral traditions and practical apprenticeship methods that survived previous collapses when institutional education failed. How do we identify essential knowledge requiring preservation? Specialization means we've lost sense of what's truly critical. Can we distinguish survival knowledge from convenience technology? Do we know which capabilities matter for rebuilding civilization versus which provide only marginal improvements to established systems? Ancient strategies remain relevant precisely because they address fundamental problems we face. Megalithic construction might seem primitive, but it's the most durable architectural approach humans have ever developed. Buildings constructed 11,000 years ago still stand. Structures built 50 years ago are already deteriorating. Oral traditions might seem inferior to writing, but they've preserved accurate information for 10,000 years, while most writing systems have become undecipherable and most documents have decayed to dust. Ritual knowledge encoding might seem superstitious, but it successfully transmitted practical information across civilizational collapses that would have destroyed purely rational knowledge systems. The distributed resilience principle matters profoundly. Pre-flood civilizations that survived catastrophe were those that dispersed knowledge geographically and across social structures. Modern globalization creates efficiency but vulnerability. Perhaps we need intentional redundancy and localization. The archaeological lesson is clear. Centralized systems are vulnerable, while distributed networks are resilient. Ancient peoples built, assuming their civilization would end. They created monuments and knowledge systems designed to communicate across catastrophe. Modern civilization assumes perpetual continuity, making no systematic preparation for collapse. The archaeological evidence suggests ancient peoples' assumptions were more realistic than ours. The pre-flood civilizations that left traces were those that encoded knowledge in stone, ritual, and oral tradition. The very methods modern society dismisses as primitive might be what enables knowledge to survive our own potential collapse. But beyond practical survival, The existence of pre-flood civilizations raises profound questions about human history, progress, and our place in the deep time of civilization's cycles. Linear progress narratives give us comfort. They suggest we're climbing toward ever greater heights. They create sense that history has direction and meaning. They make the future seem inevitably better than the past. These narratives make life feel purposeful and change feel positive. But they cost us wisdom. Linear progress makes us dismiss ancient knowledge as primitive, preventing us from learning from past civilizations' successes and failures. It creates hubris about modernity's achievements and permanence. It blinds us to civilizational patterns that might enable better choices about our own trajectory. The evidence for pre-flood civilizations suggests alternative frameworks, cyclic rather than linear time, where civilizations rise, peak, and fall in recurring patterns. Developmental rather than progressive change, where societies transform but don't necessarily improve in absolute terms. Deep time perspective, where contemporary civilization is recent episode in much longer human story. Cyclic frameworks offer different wisdom. They generate humility about our achievements. We might be rediscovering knowledge rather than discovering it for the first time. They provide case studies in civilizational success and failure, spanning far longer timescales than recorded history. They suggest knowledge lost can be recovered, and that civilizational collapse isn't terminal for human potential. They reframe our relationship to ancestors. Perhaps they weren't primitive predecessors, but sophisticated peers, whose achievements we're only beginning to understand. The philosophical implications run deep. If civilizations have risen before and been destroyed, human purpose might not be accumulating endless progress, but rather maintaining knowledge, developing wisdom, and navigating the recurring challenges of existence. If our technological society is one episode in longer story, our responsibility might be preserving what we've learned for successors while respecting what predecessors preserved for us. If catastrophe has repeatedly destroyed civilizations, resilience and adaptability matter more than peak achievement. Many people feel disconnected from deep time and ancestral roots. Acknowledging ancient civilizations reconnects us to deeper human story. Recognizing that we're part of cycles rather than linear progress can be simultaneously humbling and empowering. Understanding that our ancestors faced and sometimes overcame catastrophic challenges provides both warning and hope. This reframing affects how we view contemporary issues. Climate change becomes not unprecedented crisis, but recurring challenge. Previous civilizations faced some successfully, some not. Their experiences, preserved fragmentarily in archaeological and geological records, might offer insights for navigation. Technological advancement becomes not necessarily progress but transformation, requiring wisdom about application. Tools can build or destroy. Knowledge can enlighten or enable devastation. The question isn't whether we advance, but whether we develop wisdom matching our capabilities. Preserving knowledge becomes not just academic exercise, but sacred responsibility to future generations who will face similar challenges we face, similar catastrophes our ancestors faced. The personal dimension matters too. Understanding deep history and civilizational cycles can transform how we view our own lives. Recognizing connection to ancestors who built megalithic monuments, survived catastrophes, and preserved knowledge across millennia provides meaning and purpose beyond individual achievement. Accepting that we're temporary participants in much longer story generates both humility about our significance and appreciation for our opportunity to contribute. We didn't create civilization from nothing. We inherited knowledge, capabilities, and responsibilities from those who came before. Our task isn't achieving unprecedented heights, but faithfully navigating our time, preserving what we can, developing what wisdom we're capable of, and passing something valuable forward. The pre-flood civilizations attempted exactly this. They built in stone. They encoded knowledge in monuments. They created transmission systems. They partially succeeded. We're here, reading their messages, learning from their choices. They also partially failed. Much was lost. Much remains mysterious. Much we may never recover. Our challenge is the same. Build what endures. Preserve what matters. Develop wisdom for navigation. Pass knowledge forward. Civilizations fall and knowledge is lost. But humanity persists. Knowledge can be recovered. Each generation has opportunity to learn from the past, navigate the present wisely, and offer something valuable to the future. We're not the first human civilization to achieve sophistication. and we probably won't be the last. Understanding that doesn't diminish us but connects us to a deeper story of human resilience, knowledge, and recurring triumph over catastrophe. Which brings us back to the beginning, to that Turkish hillside where a shepherd found stones that changed everything we thought we knew about when human civilization began. After everything we've examined, what can we say with confidence? The evidence definitively establishes certain facts. Göbekli Tepe and related sites in southeastern Turkey demonstrate sophisticated construction dating to 11,600 years ago, built by pre-agricultural societies that weren't supposed to possess such capabilities. This isn't speculation. The carbon dating is verified across multiple samples. The architectural sophistication is undeniable. The chronological impossibility according to conventional frameworks is absolute. Global sea levels rose approximately 400 feet between 11,600 and 8,000 BCE, submerging vast coastal areas where human settlements likely concentrated. This is established geological fact documented in sea level charts, sediment cores, and drowned landscapes mapped through bathymetry. Geological evidence confirms catastrophic flooding events during this period. Meltwater pulses, ice dam failures releasing volumes of water equivalent to all Earth's rivers combined. Potential cosmic impacts around 10,900 BCE. These aren't theoretical reconstructions but documented events preserved in geological strata. Universal flood mythology appears across isolated cultures. From Mesopotamia to China, from Greece to the Americas, peoples with no apparent contact tell remarkably similar stories of catastrophic deluge destroying previous worlds. The consistency exceeds what coincidence or archetypes alone would predict. Genetic evidence shows population bottlenecks around 10,000 BCE. Human genetic diversity decreased dramatically during this period, consistent with catastrophic population reduction, followed by expansion from isolated refugia. The timing aligns precisely with geological catastrophe and mythological flood narratives. Archaeological sites worldwide show greater antiquity and sophistication than conventional chronology accommodated. From Indonesia to Egypt, from underwater Mediterranean to submerged Indian coastlines, structures keep emerging that challenge accepted timelines. These facts are established. Denying them requires ignoring verified evidence. What the evidence strongly suggests, without definitively proving, creates a second category. Human societies likely developed greater organizational and technical complexity during 15,000 to 12,000 BCE than conventional frameworks acknowledge. The capabilities demonstrated at Göbekli Tepe didn't emerge spontaneously. They required knowledge accumulated over generations. Coastal civilizations were probably destroyed by post-Ice Age flooding. The most favorable human habitation zones, fertile river deltas, moderate coastlines, maritime resource areas, are now underwater. Whatever existed there is precisely where we can't easily look. The Younger Dryas catastrophe severely disrupted human populations. Whether caused by cosmic impact, ice sheet dynamics, or other factors, something triggered dramatic climate reversal, population collapse, and destruction of whatever complex societies had developed. Knowledge systems appearing in post-flood civilizations, agriculture, architecture, astronomy, likely represent inheritance from earlier periods rather than independent invention. The sophistication without apparent developmental progression suggests knowledge transmitted rather than discovered. But strong suggestion isn't proof. What remains speculative and contested requires honest acknowledgement. Whether pre-flood societies achieved civilizational complexity comparable to later urban societies or remained sophisticated but non-urban is unknown. Whether specific underwater structures represent artificial construction or natural formations remains debated. Whether ancient accounts preserve historical memory or represent archetypal mythology isn't definitively resolved. We simply don't know certain things yet. How many pre-flood sites exist beneath oceans awaiting discovery? How sophisticated pre-flood societies actually were compared to later civilizations? Whether knowledge was transmitted through specific mechanisms or reinvented? What precise events triggered the Younger Dryas and subsequent catastrophes? The distinction matters. Established facts, strong inferences, working hypotheses, and pure speculation are different categories requiring different confidence levels. Not knowing everything creates space for discovery. Unanswered questions drive investigation. Acknowledging limits of current knowledge prevents dogmatism while encouraging continued inquiry. We now know civilization began thousands of years earlier than we were taught. We know catastrophe destroyed whatever came before. We know ancient peoples weren't primitive, but the biggest questions remain unanswered. But beyond current knowledge, what frontiers of investigation might answer the remaining questions? The technology to answer our biggest questions about pre-flood civilizations exists right now. We don't need future breakthroughs. We need resource allocation and institutional will to pursue systematic investigation. Underwater archaeology stands at the most promising frontier. Technologies for deep-sea exploration improve rapidly. Autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with high-resolution sonar can survey vast areas efficiently. Remotely operated submersibles can investigate identified sites at depths impossible for human divers. Systematic surveying of submerged continental shelves is becoming economically feasible. Major discoveries almost certainly await beneath coastal waters if sufficient resources are directed toward investigation. Specific locations offer extraordinary promise. The Persian Gulf was a fertile river valley during the Ice Age, now relatively shallow and accessible to investigation. Sunderland, in Southeast Asia, a landmass larger than India submerged by rising seas, likely hosted large populations, exploiting its favorable climate and resources. Mediterranean coastlines where advanced societies might have developed before flooding, river deltas worldwide that would have been prime settlement zones. We know where to look. We possess the tools to investigate. What's missing is funding and institutional commitment. Terrestrial discovery advances through emerging technology. LiDAR penetrates jungle canopy, revealing structures invisible from ground level. The technology already succeeded in finding extensive Mayan and Cambodian sites that traditional archaeology missed for decades. Systematic LiDAR surveying of tropical regions worldwide would almost certainly reveal unknown ancient constructions. Satellite multispectral imaging identifies buried structures through vegetation and soil analysis. Ground-penetrating radar becomes more sophisticated and accessible. AI analysis of archaeological data identifies patterns human researchers might miss, correlations across datasets too large for individual comprehension. The excavation frontier offers immediate opportunities. Only 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. Deeper layers potentially contain older and more sophisticated construction. Thousands of tells throughout the Middle East have deepest layers remaining unexcavated. These might push dates further back, revealing developmental progression currently invisible. Numerous sites have been identified but not yet investigated due to funding limitations or political complications. The bottleneck isn't discovery but excavation resources. Genetic research advances rapidly. Improving DNA analysis enables reconstruction of ancient population movements and interactions with increasing precision. Genetic studies might reveal population centers that later disappeared, their descendants dispersed but genetically traceable. Epigenetic research possibly uncovers information transmission across generations beyond simple genetic inheritance. Computational analysis opens new frontiers. AI translation systems might crack undeciphered ancient scripts by identifying structural patterns invisible to human analysis. Machine learning applied to existing archaeological databases could identify overlooked connections between sites and cultures. Network analysis might map knowledge transmission across ancient civilizations. Interdisciplinary integration offers transformative potential, combining geological, archaeological, genetic, linguistic, and mythological evidence into comprehensive computational models. Using climate science to reconstruct ancient environments and predict likely settlement patterns. Applying systems theory to understand civilizational collapse and knowledge transmission mechanisms. Indigenous knowledge integration represents a crucial frontier. Taking seriously oral traditions and origin accounts from indigenous peoples rather than dismissing them as mythology. Collaborating with traditional knowledge keepers who maintain information about deep history through cultural continuity. Recognizing that Western archaeological interpretation might have overlooked evidence obvious to those with unbroken connection to ancient sites. Crowdsourced research potential is already emerging. Amateur researchers using publicly available satellite imagery identify potential sites. Citizen scientists contribute to data analysis and translation projects. The democratization of research enables discoveries outside traditional institutional structures, challenging gatekeeping while expanding investigation capacity. These aren't far future possibilities, they're current capabilities. The technology exists, the locations are identifiable, the questions are clear. What's needed is will and funding to pursue investigations systematically rather than haphazardly. The technology to find pre-flood cities exists now. Underwater robots, satellite imaging, AI analysis. We just need to decide to look. And we'll find answers that will rewrite human history. But ultimately, the most important question isn't what we'll discover about the past. It's what we'll do with that knowledge once we have it. From a Turkish hillside to underwater ruins, from genetic bottlenecks to flood myths, from institutional resistance to emerging paradigm shifts. The journey reveals that human history is far deeper, stranger, and more fragile than conventional education suggests. Now we face choices. Do we continue accepting comfortable narratives, positioning modern civilization as humanity's first and greatest achievement? Or do we embrace the unsettling but possibly more accurate understanding that we're one episode in a much longer story of civilizational rise and fall? Do we dismiss ancient knowledge and capabilities as impossible because they don't fit our frameworks? Or do we develop humility about what our ancestors might have known that we've forgotten? Do we treat the past as closed book with all important questions answered, or as ongoing mystery requiring continued investigation and openness to revision? What's at stake extends beyond academic debates. Our relationship to ancestors changes depending on which framework we adopt: primitive predecessors or sophisticated peers. The choice shapes whether we approach ancient sites with condescension or respect, whether we dismiss their accounts or listen carefully, whether we assume superiority or recognize continuity. Our understanding of progress transforms. Linear advancement toward inevitable improvement, or cyclic transformation where capabilities develop but catastrophe repeatedly destroys accumulated achievement. The choice affects how we plan, what we preserve, and how seriously we take warnings about civilizational fragility. Our sense of security shifts. Assuming permanent stability creates one worldview, recognizing inherent fragility creates another. The archaeological evidence supports the latter, but the former feels more comfortable. Our responsibility to future generations depends on which story we accept. If civilization is permanent and progress inevitable, preservation seems less urgent. If catastrophe has repeatedly destroyed knowledge, ensuring transmission becomes sacred duty. Each viewer must decide what to believe about ancient history and human origins. You must weigh establishment narratives against alternative evidence. You must develop your own frameworks for evaluating contested claims. You must determine what implications these questions have for how you live and what you value. No one can make these choices for you. Collectively, we face similar decisions. How much resources should societies direct toward investigating deep history? Should institutions defend existing frameworks or genuinely follow evidence wherever it leads? Should humanity learn from past civilizations' experiences or ignore their lessons? The answers shape what we discover and what remains hidden. But here's the empowerment. You're not passive consumer, required to accept any particular narrative. The evidence is increasingly accessible for independent evaluation. Technology enables participation in discovery and verification. Truth emerges through many people honestly examining evidence rather than through institutional decree. You can investigate, you can question, you can evaluate, you can decide. And there's hope embedded in the mystery. If civilizations have risen before and been destroyed, catastrophe isn't terminal for human potential. If knowledge has been lost and recovered repeatedly, what we've forgotten can be relearned. If our ancestors survived unimaginable catastrophes and preserved enough knowledge for us to exist, resilience and wisdom are as much part of human heritage as vulnerability and forgetfulness. The pre-flood civilizations are gone, their cities drowned, their knowledge largely lost. But they left clues for those willing to look, encoded in stone, preserved in myth, written in our genes, waiting beneath the waves. Stay curious about human origins and history. Question narratives that seem too neat or convenient. Examine evidence with both skepticism and openness. Preserve and respect knowledge that has survived across millennia. Prepare wisely for possible future catastrophes. Remember that we're temporary participants in a much longer story, one that began long before us and will continue long after. We end where we began, a shepherd on a hillside finding stones that changed everything, a reminder that profound discoveries often come from simple curiosity. That truth can remain hidden for millennia before being revealed, that every generation has opportunity to recover lost knowledge and contribute to humanity's deep story. The stones are there, the myths are consistent, the evidence keeps accumulating. The only question remaining is whether we're brave enough to acknowledge what it's telling us, that everything we thought we knew about human history is wrong.